The operation was in full swing, everyone followed the Khan's plan and set out on horseback for reconnaissance. The knights rode one after another, the man who was in front turned around to look behind him. At that moment, he was suddenly attacked, some creature pierced his chest with its claw. The creature's paws were huge, blood gushed out and splattered all around. It was a hybrid of a cat and a bat, it screamed loudly, wanting to attack the others. One of the knights gave the command to the others, the first group needed to block, the rest needed to disperse. The knight jumped out of his saddle, he was about to attack the creature. The knight flew straight at the enemy, he was holding a sword in his hands and was very determined. Everyone else followed the knight's order, they immediately rushed and dispersed throughout the area. The other knights were about to release a light signal to warn the others. However, someone knocked the flashbang out of the knight's hands, he was very surprised. The one who did this was Yojsen, he was the traitor, the man believed that he was not the only traitor. A bunch of strange creatures were flying straight at the knights, they were going to attack the guys. The knights were already ready to defend themselves, they were amazed at the betrayal of their friend. Fortunately, the guys had another light signal, they needed to launch it at all costs to warn the others. Yojsen looked at them in surprise, he was going to prevent their success and prevent the launch. Suddenly, Yojsen's chest was pierced by a spear, no one expected such a turn of events. The guy looked in shock at the spear protruding from his chest, it pierced the guy's body right through. The man who neutralized the traitor was on the hill, he was wearing a ninja suit and had long spears behind him, which he skillfully threw. The man grabbed another spear behind his back and was going to help the knights defeat the creatures. He skillfully aimed his spears at his opponents, they flew with great speed. The spears instantly reached their targets, they lowered the bodies of the creatures right through. The knights were glad of such an unexpected rescue, they turned in surprise to look at their assistant. The ninja also had a light signal, he took it out from his suit. The man released a signal, he was going to notify others of the danger. A red flash rose into the sky, it meant that this group was faced with the enemy. Count Lemesandro noticed the flash and looked up at the sky in surprise. The man was angry, he understood that there was an enemy ahead and he needed to help the guys. Count Lemesandro realized that events were unfolding as Captain Khan had predicted, and his squad moved forward. The prince looked in surprise at Captain Khan, who was riding behind and remembered recent events. Captain Khan said that he would talk about specific details later, and the success or failure of the operation depended on Sir Helishut. Count Lemesandro was surprised that the entire operation depended on this knight, he didn't expect this. All the meeting participants looked in surprise at the knight Helishut, he was also confused. He needs to form a group and they will specialize in stealth infiltration under the command of Helishut, the guys should be great at this. Count Lemesandro was surprised by so many red signals, which meant that there were many enemies ahead. Knight Ramesh sighed heavily, he understood that the operation would not be easy. Night has come, it's time to take a break, the knights pitched tents in the forest. A drooping Sir Helishut entered one of the tents, he was about to report the situation. Count Lemesandro asked the guy if they had started talking, the prince was also interested in this. Knight Helishut replied that it seemed they all already knew where the guys were going. Count Lemesandro lowered his head and wondered what they should do next, the prince also drooped. At this time, Knight Ramesh shouted, he was angry at these murderers, because they dared to betray His Majesty the Emperor and join the occultists. Sir Helishut tried to calm the man down, there may have been information they didn't know. Knight Ramesh was furious, Count Lemesandro asked the prince what was best to do. The prince believed that they had no choice but to change direction, the enemies had already blocked the roads and set traps. Captain Khan thought about this situation and tried to find another solution. Knight Ramesh gave the idea that we could ask arms for help, this seemed to him not a bad idea. Count Lemesandro asked if Knight Ramesh was talking about the people of arms. Captain Khan had never heard of such a people, he was confused and was waiting for an explanation. These people belonged to a different race, but they are members of the empire and if they have not forgotten the vow handed down to them from their ancestors, they will not refuse help. Count Lemesandro was not sure that they would help, because these people are not involved in the affairs of the human world. Captain Khan seemed familiar with the words that there are people of a different race who do not go out into the world. It was already night, a fire was burning on the street, around which the princess was sitting with the younger prince and knight Chris Orlan. The princess was worried, she asked if everything would be okay. Chris Orlan said that the presence of spies has already been retold and Prince Orang will somehow solve it. The princess hoped that everything would be fine. She stroked the youngest prince on the head. At that moment, Knight Chris Orlan felt something, as if he had been shocked. He showed the princess a sign not to speak. The girl was confused. Sir Chris Orlan flew somewhere like a bullet. It seems he sensed the enemy. The man jumped from tree to tree. He moved deeper into the forest. Knight Chris Orlan pointed his sword at one of the trees. It looked like the enemy was hiding behind it. The man ordered the one hiding behind the tree to come out. He was determined. The one who was hiding listened to the knight. He took a step towards him. A beautiful young girl with elf ears appeared from behind the tree, smiling welcomingly. Sir Chris Orlan did not expect to see such an unexpected guest here. He was shocked. The girl was still smiling at him. It seemed that she was not aggressive and did not intend to attack him. At this time, Captain Khan kept thinking about the people of a different race, but belonging to the Empire, who do not go out into the world. Ken thought that we were talking about elves who belong to the Arms clan. The guy thought that it would be nice to meet them at least once. Count Lemisandro explained that even if they help, most likely it will not have much effect due to the fact that no more than 5,000 people survived from the Second Magical War and from their people. Knight Ramesh believed that they were very strong. Their weapons looked as powerful as Captain Khan's. The Count wondered why they had not shown themselves until now. Knight Ramesh asked if the Count thought they were on the good side. The Count hoped that wasn't the case, but they needed to be careful. Count Lemisandro looked at the prince carefully. He was waiting for further instructions from him. The prince explained what they were going to do next. He had a plan of action. At this time, an elf came out from behind a tree in the forest. She smiled welcomingly at Sir Chris Orlan. The guy was shocked by such an unexpected guest. He didn't expect to see her in the forest. Knight Chris Orlan asked what someone from the Arms clan was doing here. The girl replied that she simply followed the whispers of the forest and came to this place. Knight Chris Orlan clarified what the girl wants to say, whether the goddess of green leaves led her. Knight Chris Orlan turned and looked at their broken tents. The elf said that it was better to call it a vision of fate. It seemed that she was going to help them. The prince believed that since they were being pursued by the enemy, and there were traps ahead, it was worth changing course. The prince told Sir Ramesh to leave for the City of Arms tomorrow as soon as the sun rose. Even though Kong made a great contribution to yesterday's battle, he was unable to congratulate him and plans to reward him later. The prince turned to Khan for help and asked where his majesty was now and what the guy needed to find out. The count believed that first he needed to get to the castle safely. The prince first wanted to hear Khan's thoughts on this matter. Khan has already learned that the humans here are superior on the battlefield, but when it comes to espionage, his world is more advanced. Count Lemisandro asked why Captain Khan thought so. Khan replied that all the countries of his world have been at war for a long time and for them, by any means necessary, the main thing is to achieve victory and information is important. The count thought that even from the stories it sounded terrible and was no different from hell. He was surprised that the guy came from such a world. Khan replied that fortunately there are no major wars happening now, because capitalism has taken over the world. Instead, there is a war that is worse than a war with weapons, namely an economic war for every penny. Khan added that it is not right to just fight, but if it is impossible to avoid a fight, then you need to win. In his world, combat is not just a war with weapons, so countries invest huge amounts of money and time in training specialists in information warfare. Based on his previous experience, Captain Khan wanted to propose a course of action. He recommended to the prince to create a new intelligence unit in their army. The prince was surprised by the proposal to create a reconnaissance unit. He had never thought about this before. Knight Ramesh was against it. He believed that these were frivolous things and no one would want to take on such responsibility. Khan believed that fortunately there was someone here who was ideally suited for the task he had just mentioned. The captain looked at the Knight Helishut. The guy was very surprised. The prince turned to Knight Helishut, who responded. The prince asked if the knight would do this. He had high hopes for him. Helishut was clearly not happy. He didn't quite understand how to do this. However, he could not refuse. The knight bowed. He was ready to do whatever it took to carry out the order of the crown prince. Knight Ramesh came up with something after Khan's story. He asked what about political maneuvers, including campaigning. He thought that the influence would be great even in the capital, which was now captured by the enemy. It was necessary to introduce spies who would inform the people. The prince thought about this proposal too. At this point, the prince was informed that Sir Chris Orlan was requesting an audience with the crown prince. The prince agreed to receive the knight Chris Orlan and ordered him to be let in. Chris Orlan entered the tent and greeted His Highness the Prince. He said that someone wants to meet with him. The prince asked who it was. She describes herself as the deity of the Arms clan. It was that same elf. Everyone in the tent was very surprised. They did not expect such an unusual guest. The prince ordered to let her in immediately. He really wanted to meet her. The elf girl entered the tent. She smiled welcomingly. The girl wished that the goddess of green leaves would illuminate the future of His Majesty with the brightest light. Dawn came, the column of knights moved forward to carry out their mission. The elf walked next to the prince, showing him the way, followed by Captain Can. The guy looked forward at these two in surprise. He had never seen such people. The elf girl turned around and also looked at Captain Khan. The elf girl smiled at him. It seemed she knew that he was from another world. Ka Shuera asked if Lenu was unwell, because he looked strange. The guy replied that everything was fine. Khan knew that the Arms clan was a forest tribe. He asked if everyone from the tribe was like her. Ka Shuera did not immediately understand who Captain Can was talking about. She did not think for long. The girl looked at the elf and immediately understood everything. She grinned slyly. Ka Shuera asked if the elf was beautiful, but there was one problem. She was about 300 years old. At this time, a luxurious carriage was driving through the forest, accompanied by two knights on horseback. Someone was riding in a carriage. He pulled back the curtain on the window and looked out the window. A small hand appeared from the carriage window. It was wearing a bracelet with a magical symbol. This person threw away her white handkerchief and was blown away from the carriage by the wind. The handkerchief flew through the air. It seemed to be a sign that this person was passing through here. He had to help the others find which way the carriage was moving. At this time, people in long black cloaks were flying in the forest. They looked dangerous. The people in raincoats stopped. They looked at the forest from a bird's eye view and were looking for something. They noticed how far away the lights were in the forest. They came from the tents of the prince's detachment. One of the people looked closely at the tents and wondered what to do next. Unexpectedly for himself, he noticed something flying across the sky and heading straight towards him. It was the handkerchief with me, thrown out of the carriage. This man reached for him. The scarf was actually a message. There was something written on it in an unknown language. Using his native language, this man told the others what to do. He pointed forward. The rest flew like a bullet through the forest to the tent city, following the order of their leader. The prince's detachment went further through the forest. It was a long column of horses. One of the knights said that they would soon arrive in the city. The prince and Count Lemesandro looked at each other. They were about to carry out their plan. The prince's detachment moved further. The horsemen went first, followed by the carts. Count Lemesandro pointed to the side and asked if this is where they should go next. The elf girl smiled and nodded. They moved along her route. Knight Helishut looked at Count Lemesandro and considered that the time had come to act. Parts of the knights, led by Sir Helishut, quickly galloped in that direction. They had their own task. One of the guys who was galloping behind the Knight Helishut clutched his bag in his hands. Apparently he was carrying something important. The count asked Khan if this was enough. The guy replied that for a start, yes. The count was sorry that he had to send the guys without proper preparation. He felt as if they were being sent to their deaths. Knight Ramesh believed that they only needed to prepare the base, so there would be no serious problems. Count Lemesandro said that he would hope so and bowed down. Count Lemesandro told everyone else not to relax until they were out of the forest. He ordered everyone to resume movement and switch to Halup. At this time, Helishut's small detachment was heading in the other direction. They split up. At this time, a woman in a red cape watched everything that was happening with the help of a magic ball. There was a red mark on her arm that apparently helped activate her abilities. She realized that the prince's knights were moving towards the Arms clan. The mark stopped glowing. The woman believed that they were looking for a place to die. She grinned. The woman got up from the table. She believed that it was even more convenient to implement her plans. However, it bothered her that she had to run after impudent, greedy people like this. The woman left her room and walked along a dark gray corridor. The woman entered a beautiful hall. A girl was sitting on a throne, surrounded by her subjects. The woman greeted Her Majesty. Her Majesty told her to come in quickly, because she was waiting for a woman. The girl sat imposingly on the throne. Before the day there were many treats. She was holding a glass of wine in her hands. The woman in the red cape grinned. everything seemed to be going according to plan. It was sunset outside, the sun was slowly sinking below the horizon, the sky was shimmering with different colors. Knight Ramesh noticed that it would soon get dark and it would become dangerous to walk. The elf girl replied that there was no need to worry, because they were almost there. Knight Ramesh was surprised by such a word, because so far nothing was visible except the forest. The horses suddenly stopped, and fog appeared around, filling the entire forest. All the knights were surprised, the residents also looked around in confusion. Ka Shuera was wary, she believed that this could be a sign of impending danger. Lu believed that it would be very bad if they were attacked in such a place. Ka Shuera reassured him, because she would immediately understand everything. Khan considered this strange, because in the surrounding area there are no lakes or large rivers and there is no geothermal heat either. Where does this fog come from? Ka Shuera asked what happened. Khan believed that it was simply too quiet around. The girl agreed with him, because there were no sounds around. At this moment, the elf girl walked forward, her hair flowing beautifully in the wind. She stood in front of the entire squad. The girl knew what to do. They came. A hand appeared in front of her out of nowhere. Someone spoke in a language unknown to the children. Lu was very surprised, he did not understand what was happening, whether any danger was approaching. The hand in front of the elf glowed, she activated her power. The light was so bright that it blinded the eyes of the knights and the prince. The prince was surprised by what he saw in front of him, the guy was in shock. Kan and Ka Shuera were also confused, they looked ahead in surprise. The princess and the younger prince were riding in the carriage, they looked out the carriage window to look around. The younger prince was very surprised, he exclaimed that it was very beautiful around. It turns out that the elf girl led them to her city, it was huge and very peaceful. Castles rose majestically around, they amazed observers with their luxury. Giant bridges were built over the rivers, and everything around was decorated with luxurious statues and columns. Birds were flying in the sky, the entire squad looked around in surprise. The elf girl approached the edge of the cliff, from here a beautiful view of the entire city opened up. The elf girl wished that everyone present would be blessed by the goddess of green leaves. The girl welcomed them to Lador, that was the name of her beautiful city. Birds were flying in the sky, the entire squad looked around in surprise. The elf girl approached the edge of the cliff, from here a beautiful view of the entire city opened up. Along with Ka Shuera and Lu, looked at the city of Lador in surprise. At that moment, unexpectedly for everyone, something flashed before the guy's eyes, they did not have time to react. The prince's detachment was already surrounded by locals, they were not very friendly. Elves with bows and arrows positioned themselves around the detachment, they pointed their weapons at the knights. Kan and Ka Shuera looked around in surprise, they were surprised that they did not notice how all these elves appeared. One of the elves said something to the elf girl in his native language, she explained the whole situation to him. This elf looked at the guys incredulously, it seemed that he understood what was happening here and who they were. All the elves lowered their bows and signaled to the knights that they could go. Lu sighed with relief, he was already afraid of the elf army. Khan thought this was strange, because elves are a forest race, and in addition to leaves, they also use leather. Ka Shuera asked why Captain Kan froze and did not move on, the guy came to his senses. The prince's detachment drove into the city, they drove along the bridge, while all the local residents gazed at the knights. The party decided to stop in this city, they pitched tents near the houses of other elves. The local residents were friendly towards the children, the elf girls brought them treats and treasure chests. One of the girls led the knights up the long stairs into the castle. The girl explained that this castle has been guarding this place for more than 1,000 years and during this time there have been many invasion attempts, but none of them were successful. Count Lemisandro was very surprised, he couldn't wait to see the grandeur of this place. The guys climbed the castle tower, they walked to the edge and watched the city. Ka Shuera thought it incredible. Lu noticed that the city looked a little tacky, but it was comparable in size to the capital. Ka Shuera believed that the people here lived so close that they created their own culture. Khan asked if they lived very closed off from the world. Ka Shua said that the guys saw their armor and weapons earlier, they believe that monsters have a soul. Lu added that there is a tradition of making armor and weapons from the skin and bones of monsters that they raised after death and keeping them with them for the rest of their lives. At that moment, something caught Captain Khan's attention and he looked up at the sky in surprise. A huge dragon flew right in front of him, with an elf riding on it. Captain Khan thought it looked like a squadron of combat aircraft. Ka Shuera didn't understand what he was talking about. Khan explained that these weapons were designed to gain air superiority, like flying cars. Lu was inspired. He was very interested in what kind of flying cars they were, whether they looked like flying boats. He said they're similar, but a little different, looks a little more agile. Captain Khan added that the speed and movements of the planes are similar to flying dragons. Lu kept asking about combat aviation. Khan added that it's not exactly a direct attack, they drop shells and fire a machine gun at enemies. The captain looked into the sky. It seemed to him that the movements of these dragons were really similar to a combat aircraft. At this time, dragons with elves sitting astride them were flying in the sky like a wedge. At this time, the elf with the prince and Count Lemisandro came to the huge door of the castle. There was a guard of elves at the gate. They looked in disbelief at the arriving guests. The elf explained that Pedra had given permission for an official audience. Count Lemisandro thought that they had many people and were protected by warriors who were divided into 3 categories. There were warriors who rode monsters, warriors who used spirits and magic, and warriors who engaged and fought with their bodies. Above them are priests who are responsible for the rights of the ancestors and governance. Pedra, who rules them all, is considered the queen and leader. Count Lemisandro looked forward in surprise. He was impatient to meet such a powerful lady. The castle door slowly opened, revealing a view of a huge hall. In the center of the hall stood a huge tree. There were no leaves on it, and its trunk rose many tens of meters. Prince and Count Lemisandro did not expect to see such a picture in front of them. They were amazed by the grandeur of this place. On a tree trunk, as if on a throne, sat a little girl, an elf in a beautiful green dress. The prince felt uneasy. He did not know where to start a conversation with this girl. The prince greeted the goddess of green leaves and introduced himself by his full name, followed by Count Lemisandro. The girl's name was Eumafinas. She greeted the guests on behalf of the goddess of green leaves. At this time, somewhere far away in the forest, strange things were happening. Night fell in the yard. An army of strange creatures that looked like orcs was moving along the forest ladder. They looked creepy. Along with them were huge carrier creatures, as well as flying monsters. A man was riding on one of the creatures in a carriage. He was wearing a black cape and holding a cane in his hands. People were riding on flying monsters. This army was heading to defeat someone. At this time, in the city of the elves, Petra's guests sat down at a long table. She was ready to listen to them. At this time, a black bird flew past the castle window. The prince did not even pay attention to it. The bird looked like a black raven. Its eyes glowed red. The princess looked out of the castle window, and she also noticed a bird. The girl put her hands to her mouth and began to whistle to this bird. The bird seemed to recognize her. It responded to the girl's whistle and looked at her. The bird instantly changed its route and headed to the princess's window. It seemed they had already met. The bird flew into the princess's room and sat on her hand. The bird brought a message for the princess. The girl took the letter in her hands and began to read it carefully. The princess did not want anyone to see the letter, so she burned it with her powers. There was absolutely nothing left of the letter. It burned to the ground. There were ashes on the floor. And at this time 2 elves were flying in the forest. It seemed they were running away from something. The elves deftly jumped through the trees. Someone was chasing them and almost caught up with them. One of them was grabbed by a huge green tentacle. The elf could not escape from the enemy's clutches. The second elf pulled away a little from his brother. He looked back in surprise and saw a terrifying picture. Another elf asked her friend not to worry about him and leave, and also to tell the others that a large army was coming. His friend did not want to leave the elf. He looked at him with pain. He shouted at him to quickly leave and inform the padre that the enemies were advancing. He was going to stay. Another elf decided to listen to his friend. With tears in his eyes, he turned around and hurried in the opposite direction. This elf was left to fight against this huge army. He took out his bow and arrows and prepared to defend himself. The elf quickly flew away from his pursuit. He tried with all his might to break away. 3 people in black cloaks flew behind him. They were catching up with their prey. It was hard for the elf to fly away so quickly. He was out of breath and trying to catch his breath. At that moment, I noticed a large tree growing on a cliff. The elf hid behind him. She hid and tried not to make a sound. It seemed that the men in cloaks could not find her. The elf exhaled with relief. She managed to break away from the chase and hide behind a tree. The girl looked at her hand. There was some kind of bag in it. She had to make sure to convey this. At this time, a banquet was taking place in the city's castle in honor of the newly arrived guests. Everyone enjoyed the delicious dishes. Lu said that based on Kang's words, a bomb of this size could easily blow up 1 or 2 buildings. Captain Khan replied that it depends on the power, but something like that. The captain pointed to the castle located nearby and said that these were generally trivial things and that some bombs could easily destroy entire cities. The guys were very surprised. Ka Shuera thought it was cruel. She asked if this was not just a massacre. Lu explained that in war, sometimes it is better to finish everything at once so that there are fewer casualties. The girls still considered it pointless, because in any case it was a fight. Ka Shuera was sure that with strong convictions, opponents face each other with their swords and do everything possible to live and not die in this battle. Captain Khan thought they were both right, but the answer would vary depending on the size of the enemy. After all, if a large number of enemies come and it is an attack from the air, the methods of fighting will be different. Thinking about battle tactics, the guy looked out the window. There were battle dragons with elves on them soaring high in the sky. Ka Shuera asked what the guy was thinking about that he didn't even answer her call. Khan said nothing like that. Lu asked enthusiastically if the guys had seen erection. Captain Khan did not understand what the boy was talking about. He spoke of the dragon, Drexion's bastard. He surpasses everyone with his ability to fly. Captain Khan was very interested in this dragon. He thought that it was an excellent weapon. Captain Khan added that formation flying isn't a big deal, it's just a tactic based on how to effectively form a formation. Ka Shuera thought it was important to fly in formation like this and throw a bomb. Lu agreed with the girl. The guy was inspired. He thought that with such tactics he wouldn't have to do anything with his hands at all. Khan added that there are several ways to bomb. At that moment, someone approached the table where the guys were sitting. He asked to tell us more about this. Ka Shuera and Lu were wary. They looked at their new acquaintance incredulously. Ka Shuera asked with an angry look who allowed the stranger to eavesdrop on their conversations like that. A high elf approached them. He believed that this was the place for everyone to get together to drink and talk. The guys didn't know this man. Lu asked if he was a rider. The elf was the commander of the Ericsson Riders, Mmo Sol. The man introduced himself. He also introduced his comrades, who were sitting drinking at the next table. They smiled welcomingly. Mmo Sol apologized if he caused inconvenience to the guys with his unexpected appearance. Ka Shuera snorted in anger. Mmo Sol wanted to know more about what Captain Kong said earlier about some kind of machine gun. Captain Ken looked at Ka Shuera. She was very unhappy with such impoliteness of the captain of the riders. Captain Khan believed that to talk about the elements, you first need to know about fighters. Captain Ken began to tell everything she knew about the modern weapons of his world to her new elves. Mmo Sol listened to him carefully. He crossed his arms over his chest and tried to understand what Captain Khan was talking about. He said that Luftwaffe pilots gained experience from the Spanish Civil War and immediately applied it to their fighters. Lu realized that they were equipped with a machine gun to gain an advantage. Khan added that if air superiority is lost, bombing itself will be impossible. Mmo Sol believed that if they changed this tactic to erection, it would help a lot, but the elves did not have such weapons. They wanted to tighten up the strategy a little more. Lu agreed that they did not have machine guns, but thought that they could try to make something similar to bombs for bombing. The elves realized that Lu was a magician. One elf thought that the guy was too young for such serious matters. Ka Shuera believed that the wizard was a wizard and explained that he was the student of a former archmage from the imperial family who lived in a magic tower. Mmo Sol was both surprised and delighted that he had acquired such useful and strong acquaintances. Mmo Sol wanted to ask Kong for a favor. The guy believed that they were not in a position to make decisions alone. The captain was going to talk about this with His Highness the Prince, and if he said that everything was in order, he would tell everything he knew. The elf's eyes shone with happiness. Captain Khan thought that we were talking about increasing the power of the army. The prince, together with Count Lemisandro, sat at a reception in Pedra Castle. The guys sat down at a large long table. The prince said that 3 days had passed since Ser Helishut had sent to the capital to clarify the situation. The messengers who had dispersed to the cities were already reporting the news one after another. Pedra asked if they were taking too long. The elf reassured her, because until reinforcements arrive, they alone will be able to protect the city. Pedra agreed with her, because her city, Lothiador, was truly an impregnable fortress. Pedra believed that since they were crazy, if someone ordered something to be done, they were even capable of killing their family, and who knows what else they were capable of. The elf was ready to even lose her life. Pedra, capricious, screamed that she didn't want Lola to die. The girl believed that first they needed to do what they could at the moment. Today, passing by, she saw that the soldiers' weapons were quite old and damaged. The Count said that nothing could be done about it and that this detachment was recruited in a hurry. Because of the battles of the past, weapons became unusable and people were tired. Lola already knew the whole situation. She was going to propose a plan of action, taking into account their conditions. The girl stated that the elves had opened an arsenal of weapons for them. At this time, the girl who was being chased by strange creatures finally got out of the forest. She was exhausted. The girl's name was Cursed. She found her brothers. They were very excited and ran to her aid. Cursed fell into their arms. Her friends were trying to revive her. They were going to take the girl inside. Cursed reached behind her back with trembling hands. She was going to get something from there and show it to her friends. The girl pulled out a bag from behind her back. She handed it to her elf friend with twisting hands. Cursed said that an army of enemies was coming here. The girl could barely speak. She asked to give this bag to Pedra. Cursed was seriously injured in battles with enemies. She could no longer speak and fell silent. Her hand with the pouch fell to the ground. It seemed Cursed was dead, but she managed to complete her last mission. At this time, life in Lador went on as usual. Elves were working around. Everyone was doing their own thing. Lu was sitting on the woodshed. He was holding a notebook in his hands and was diligently thinking about something. Ka Shuera approached the boy and asked if Lu was doing well. He was writing something down in his notebook. The guy thought the power was a little weaker than expected, but still quite useful. Ka Shuera asked if the fire magic the boy was using was more powerful than this. Lu agreed, but even so, it could cause considerable damage to enemies. Ka Shuera realized that if this was used, Erection Squadron would be able to conduct a wider range of operations. Lu hoped so. Lu asked Ka Shuera where Captain Kan was now. The girl thought that he was now with Emosul. She asked if the boy wanted to talk to him. Lu really wanted this. He asked him to tell the captain that if the girl saw him, he would come to the boy. He needed to ask something. Ka Shuera understood everything. She already had to go. She said goodbye to Lu and waved after him. At this time, Captain Khan spoke about the weapons and tactics of his world to the elf riders. Captain Khan believed that group tactics should be enough. He drew a diagram on the board. Emosul agreed with the man. He believed that this could more effectively neutralize enemy attacks. At that moment, Ka Shuera came into their room. She turned around, looking for Captain Kan. Emosul happily waved to the girl. She looked at him angrily and did not want to be polite. Ka Shuera said that Kan's name was Count. She was surprised that the guy did not know about this, because he had met Prince Orang. Khan said that the prince was looking at him intently. Ka Shuera herself didn't know what happened. She asked if the operation meeting was over. Khan corrected her, because this was not exactly an operation meeting. The girl didn't care. She asked if they were finished. Emosul said that they could not continue to take up a busy man's time. He thanked Khan for what he had done for the elves over the past few days. Khan believed that he was simply telling them some things that he knew himself. Emosul convinced him that they had received very important knowledge and this was a great contribution to their future. Emosul asked Kan to convey to Prince Orang his gratitude for his assistance. Kan and Ka Shuera smiled. They didn't mind doing what the elf asked them to do. At this time, an army of elves lined up next to the huge gates, together with the prince and Count Lemisandro. And Ka Shuera and Captain Kan approached this place. They found Count Lemisandro. Captain Khan hurried to the Count, because he was looking for him. The man turned around and looked at the guy. Count Lemisandro nodded to the elf that she could act. The girl understood his command and looked up. She also nodded to someone. A huge elf stood next to her. He looked at the girl and understood what she meant. This elf loudly shouted to his subjects to open the arsenal. The rest of the elves began to push the huge wooden doors with great effort. Captain Khan and Count Lemisandro were shocked and they looked at what was hidden behind these doors. Ka Shuera also stared in surprise at the arsenal of the elves. She could not believe her eyes. In front of the guys there was a huge room that looked like a warehouse. There were magical weapons neatly laid out everywhere. There were a lot of blades, balls, crossbows, spears and much more that would help the guys in battle. The elf explained that everything here is many years old, but as they see, the condition of the storage is excellent. because they have divine power. Count Lemisandro was inspired. He ordered everyone to choose weapons and put on armor that would suit them. Count Lemisandro turned around and looked at Captain Khan. He asked what about him. The guy replied that it was fine for him, the military uniform he was wearing was the most comfortable for him. Ka Shuera shrugged, they couldn't force Khan to put on the armor. Ka Shuera was in solidarity with the captain, she also did not need anything in this arsenal. Count Lemisandro was surprised, he offered to help the girl distribute weapons and armor to the soldiers. At that moment, the ringing of bells was suddenly heard, it was very loud and frightening, spreading over a huge distance. The guys listened to the strange sounds in surprise, they were scared and expected something dangerous. Ka Shuera asked what was happening and what this sound meant. One of the elves explained that it seemed that the enemies had reached the border. Ka Shuera and Captain Kan were very surprised, they did not expect this to happen so quickly. The pouch from Herseth was successfully delivered to Pedra, she sat on her throne and held it in her hands. The girl opened the bag and took out a folded sheet of paper. It was said there that there are approximately 100,000 of them, they have already passed the plains of Mados and are entering the forest, and there are also military operations in the direct direction. Pedra didn't quite understand what was being said here, she asked her assistant. The elf explained to her the meaning of what Herseth wanted to say. Pedra was horrified. The girl called the commander, the prince and Count Lemisandro to her. From the founding of Lador until the age of magic, no one entered this city without the permission of the goddess of green leaves. She ordered the commander to go into the forest under the protection of the goddess and tell them about this. They are the ones who fell under the yoke of the goddess, Armin had to punish them. Armin bent his knee, he obediently agreed to carry out Pedra's order. Pedra believed that they should rely on each other to overcome difficulties. She proposed to the prince of the empire to form a clan before the end of the war. The prince, who acted on behalf of His Majesty the Emperor, gladly accepted Pedra's offer. The girl ordered Robert to prepare forces in case of infection of the enemy and to take all necessary measures for the battle on the waters. The girl also bowed her head, she was ready to carry out Pedra's order. At that moment, a group of elf riders mounted their battle dragons and set off. They flew high in the sky, trying to reach the enemy as quickly as possible. The elves looked carefully down at the ground, they tried to find something there. One of the elves showed something to the other, he pointed his finger at the ground. A huge army of enemies was walking through the forest, they lined up in a column and were advancing on the city. The elf told Arisia to go first and report to Amosul about the situation, and Karis would go with him and try to penetrate deeper into the enemy camp. The elves followed the plan, the others looked at them from the branches of the tree. This elf told the other not to be embarrassed, they just had to do as Captain Khan said. The elf told everyone else to get into formation and prepare for the plan. He started rummaging in his pocket, trying to get something out of it. The elf took out a small vial of purple liquid, he was very determined. A large explosion was heard in the sky, the sound from it spread for kilometers. Several more explosions were heard behind him, they were aimed at the elves on the dragons. They tried to evade and maneuver out of danger. A man in a black robe was watching the elves, he was looking intently at the sky. This man was unusual, he had no face, and instead of eyes there were luminous balls. It looked like someone was watching everything through his eyes. This creature was an enemy of the elves. The man's eyes glowed brightly with purple light and activated the power. Through this creature, a woman with long black hair observed everything that was happening. She was very hostile, the woman recalled the events of past days. 20 years ago she was in a slum in the city, there were poor people around. Men in white robes walked in the center, they distributed bread to the hungry people. Walking with them was a little girl holding the hand of a woman in a red robe. The girl watched everything that was happening in surprise, she liked to see the enthusiastic faces of people. She looked at the woman who accompanied her, she was smiling, everything seemed calm. At that moment, suspicious screams were heard nearby, and the woman turned around to look at them. Knights came to the slums, they began to cut up the poor inhabitants, they offended their area and were very scared. The woman was shocked, she saw this cruel picture, she hugged the girl. The man in the white Monty nodded to the woman and made a sign, he was surprisingly calm. The woman grabbed the girl and began to run away to protect the child. The girl was crying and screaming, I didn't want to lose this man, she was scared. At some point, the girl accepted everything that was happening and calmed down, she watched everything that happened with sadness. Before her eyes, the third brutally killed peaceful people, everything around was covered in flames. Now this girl has grown up, she has become an adult woman, but her childhood traumas have not gone away. She was very angry, she wanted to burn everything around in a rage. The woman wanted to take revenge on Emperor Burnus. Well, even if he cried tears of blood, she would not forgive him for anything. First of all, she was going to send him to hell with him and everyone he loves. In the city of elves, a large army lined up in front of the castle walls. The soldiers were ready to defend the city and kingdoms, they were waiting for further instructions. The prince stated that this battle was inevitable, but had no intention of making them die because of it. He said their families are behind them now. If they did not retreat, their family would shed blood in their place, so the soldiers had to hold on. The emperor was now behind them. The prince raised the iron and ordered the military to defend the city with the determination to die here. Captain Khan was on the castle wall. He asked if the truth would come under a lot. Ka Shuera didn't know the answer. A messenger was sent, but if they were going, they would probably have already arrived. The girl believed that even if they moved out to help them, they would definitely not be able to arrive on time. According to intelligence officers who returned from reconnaissance, the number of enemies is more than 150,000. Their numbers are clearly superior. Even after the unification of the two camps, the allies numbered a little more than 10,000 people. Captain Khan observed the peaceful life in the city. Children with their mothers walked along the street, not suspecting anything. The man believed that this was a fight that could not be played. Unexpectedly, Captain Khan heard someone say that the green leaf goddess was watching. It was Armin. He said that their city was impregnable and the goddess was protecting them. They would never lose, so his warriors had to have no doubts and fight. He was confident of victory. He ordered his subjects to show no mercy to those who dared to enter their holy city. Khan looked in surprise at the jubilant military men. He was surprised at the oratorical abilities of the guys. At that moment, a howl was heard from the horn, which meant that battle was imminently approaching. Captain Khan looked into the forest with inspiration. Evening had come in the yard, the sun was sinking below the horizon. Some strange sounds were heard in the forest. The guys did not understand what it meant. The sound grew stronger, apparently someone was approaching. Birds were flying across the sky. The sound of iron armor was heard. Someone stepped on the ground, and was ready to fight. A huge army of tens of thousands of people in armor was walking through the forest. Creatures were flying with them. They were belligerent. The allies were surprised by such a number. They did not expect such a large-scale battle. Their army looked in surprise at the sky, at the flying monsters. They had never seen them. Count Lemisandro ordered the army not to retreat. They had to close ranks and prepare for battle. Monsters in the sky were screaming. Horsemen were flying towards them, about to attack. Imosul shouted loudly and gave a sign that the enemy was advancing. He was determined to defeat everyone. The man led a squad of dragon riders. They quickly flew straight into the thick of things. Everyone was ready for battle. The army was waiting for a sign from their commanders who stood on the walls of the castle. Knight Ramesh gave the command to his subjects to prepare. A man stood on the wall with a crossbow in his hands. The elf dragons and flying monsters were already ready to collide in a brutal bloody battle. They flew straight towards each other. At this time, Captain Khan was watching everything that was happening nearby with a sniper rifle. He found what he was looking for. He aimed his sight at one of the opponents. He believed that even if there are a lot of enemies, if you destroy the head, it will paralyze the control system. He targeted the most important enemy, and was going to implement his plan. The battle began. The terrifying sounds of a brutal struggle between flying creatures were heard. The battle began. The terrifying sounds of a brutal struggle between flying creatures were heard. Captain Khan still managed to hit the target. He shot through the commander's head. All the other opponents looked at their main one in surprise. They did not expect such a turn of events. Imosul was on the alert. He waited for Captain Khan to open the way for them to attack. The man shouted and signaled to his subordinates that they could attack. The dragons flew forward. At that moment, strange sounds were heard from the towers that were located behind the army. Knight Ramesh was surprised. Apparently there were enemies hiding in it. The opponents had their bows and arrows ready and were about to attack. They released a barrage of arrows that flew high, aiming to hit their target. Count Lemisandro signaled to Knight Ramesh to prepare to act. Knight Ramesh nodded to one of the soldiers. He was going to warn him. The guy raised a white flag with a blue stripe in the center. It meant that you need to get ready. All the other soldiers on the castle wall raised their shields and began to defend themselves. A flurry of arrows hit the target. Some guys did not have time to defend themselves and were defeated. The allies were also ready to attack. The guys took out bows and arrows and were going to counterattack. Knight Ramesh ordered one of the guys to raise a white flag with a red stripe. The man shouted to the others to attack. The soldiers fired their arrows at the opponents. They acted coherently to achieve results. The arrows hit the opponents. The defeated enemies fell to the ground. Knight Ramesh ordered the army to concentrate on the siege towers. The soldiers aimed their bows and arrows at the siege towers and fired from them. It seems there was no effect. The enemy on the siege towers was not defeated. It was necessary to act more decisively. Count Lemesandro grabbed the bow from the hands of one of the guys. He was about to act himself. The man aimed his bow and arrow at one of the towers. He believed that he could do a better job. At that moment, Lu flew up to Count Lemesandro and began to use magic on the man's arrow. The arrow glowed with a bright light. The guy's magic began to act. It was supposed to help defeat the enemy. Count Lemesandro looked at Lu carefully. He understood perfectly well what the guy had done with the arrow. Lu nodded back, which was a sign that the man could shoot. Count Lemesandro fired his bow. The arrow flew towards the tower with great speed. It was no longer an ordinary arrow. It moved more maneuverable and faster than ordinary arrows. As soon as it hit the target, there was a loud explosion. The arrow did its job. The siege tower began to bow to one side, and was about to fall. Lu had not yet finished casting his spell. He used the flame of destruction technique. He had to burn the world with the energy of twilight. Lu directed his magical energy at the tower. This should have completely destroyed it. The tower fell, a huge explosion was heard, and flames burned around. All the knights rejoiced. However, this was not yet a victory. The enemy also knew how to cast magic and tried to stop the fire. Count Lemesandro looked at what was happening in surprise. He did not expect such a turn of events. Knight Ramesh looked at the sky in surprise. There were flying monsters fluttering around, with large boulders in the sky. The man ordered everyone to prepare for the strike. It was necessary to attack before the enemy did. Huge stones flew towards the castle. They had destructive power. The soldiers ran away. When the stones hit the castle walls, explosions were heard that could have brought down the entire wall. There were a lot of stones. One of these would have fallen on one of the guys. Lu was surprised by this situation. He quickly flew to the aid of the guys. He saw cannonball throwing installations placed in the square. Lu thought now was the time to use them. One of the guys was holding a shell. Lu didn't understand why the guys weren't acting yet. Now it was necessary to counterattack and turn the enemy. Their general gave a sign that it was time to launch shells. She loudly announced this. The installations for throwing projectiles came into action. They had destructive power. The shells flew straight at the enemy. There was no way for them to hide from such military weapons. The shells finally reached their targets. They fell to the ground exploding, leaving behind huge explosions. Count Lemesandro looked at this in surprise. He understood that the development of bullets was a little late, but still completed. However, there were a lot of enemies. Captain Khan was the only one who could be trusted. Ka Shuera also rode to the rescue on her horse. She brought with her several knights. Captain Khan understood that there were as many catapults as there were enemies, and at this rate he believed they would be able to push the enemies back. The captain thought that if they had had a little more time, they could have acted completely differently. Or if the bullets Lu made were even a little stronger, they would be able to win faster. No matter how you look at it, it was not a profitable war for them, but all that remained was to fight to the end. Captain Khan thought about the troops who said they would return to save him, about his mother and little sister. The guy remembered them in a joint photograph, which he viewed on a tablet in the cave. Captain Khan believed that he had to win and that was the only way he could return home. Imosul was determined. He ordered his subjects to open the gates. Ka Shuera rode out through the gate with the rest of the troops. The girl was in a militant mood. Ka Shuera raised her sword and ordered everyone else to advance. Her squad rushed into battle, the girl leading several dozen elves on horseback. Captain Khan stopped. He was thinking about how they could win this battle. One of the guys blew the horn loudly. He gave a signal to the others. This was a sign to attack. At that moment the horses and riders fiercely advanced to the attack. At the head of their squad was Ka Shuera. She was fiercely determined not to give the enemy a break. The girl ordered to cut down everything that stands in the way and go straight to the goal. She herself followed her instructions. The girl quickly ran into battle and beheaded the enemy with one swipe of her sword. Imosul fought with her. he had excellent combat training, he mercilessly cut down his enemies. Count Lemisandro watched the entire battle, he watched carefully so as not to miss anything important. A flurry of stones fell on the allies, the knight Ramesh ordered his squad to hold out until the last. The soldiers fired at the enemy towers with bows and arrows, but it didn't seem to help much. Lu commanded the catapults, the guys loaded the installations with shells. At that moment, a cobblestone fell near the installations, a strong explosion was heard, and several people died. Lu looked in that direction in surprise, he understood that danger was approaching. Near the place where the cobblestone fell there were shells for the catapult. These shells exploded, they threw Lu back with a shock wave, the explosion was very large in scale. One of the knights was defeated, he lay on the ground and held on with his last strength. He ordered the others to defend their positions upon command to fire at least one shot. The guys succeeded, one shell flew towards the enemy positions. It brought heavy losses to the enemy, and many explosions were heard. The enemy's observation towers began to move, they were equipped with wheels. Opponents on the towers approached the walls of the city, they had a plan to climb them. Knight Ramesh was going to prevent the enemy from entering the city, he ordered to stop them at any cost. The enemies began to land on the walls, the knights were confused, they did not expect this. However, the guys quickly gathered and began to fight, one soldier pierced the enemy with a sword directly in the head. Another shot his opponent's neck with a bow, they held up great. Riser Ramesh himself fought, he ordered them to hold on with the determination to die. The man shouted a loud battle cry, he needed to prevent you from defeating your enemies. Count Lemisandro was also involved in the battle, he skillfully ended the lives of his enemies with one swing of his sword. And at that moment, an enemy appeared behind Count Lemisandro, with an axe in his hands. Knight Ramesh saw this scene from the wall, he looked at them in surprise. Knight Ramesh shouted to Count Lemisandro, he wanted to warn his ally of the danger. Count Lemisandro turned around, he did not expect to see someone behind him, at that moment the enemy swung. Something quickly flew past the count and rushed towards the enemy, it was not even clear what it was. This weapon overpowered the enemy and hit the man directly in the chest. The enemy looked at his body in surprise, a small sword was inserted into it. The one who threw them had several more, he held all the small blades in his hand. This man killed several enemies at a time with deft movements, he moved very quickly and skillfully. Sir Orlan came to the aid of the guys, he was the one who saved Count Lemisandro. Count Lemisandro was glad to see such an ally, he was grateful to the guy for saving him. Sir Orlan was very serious, he nodded to the Count in solidarity. Count Lemisandro was not surprised, since Sir Orlan was the first sword of the Empire. However, Count Lemisandro was still worried about something. He looked in surprise at the horizon. Numerous explosions could be seen in the distance, the enemy army outnumbered theirs. Count Lemisandro clenched his teeth, he understood that if this continued, they would not last long. The Count thought that it would be nice if he could neutralize the catapults and archers of the enemies. At this time, Kashwara's detachment boldly rushed into battle, they rode horses right into the thick of things. Elves galloped after them, one of them asked Kashuera to move away a little and give him room to act. The elf picked up the crossbow and boldly pointed it forward at the enemy. Kashuera was surprised and asked if it was possible. Captain Khan believed that the first step was to try and put his plan into action. The man picked up his sniper rifle, he was going to use it to defeat the enemy. The captain took aim, he knew exactly where to shoot and what to do in this situation. Captain Khan got ready, he needed to aim accurately so as not to miss. The man pulled the trigger and fired his sniper rifle. The bullet hit one of the enemies directly on the head, it was an accurate hit. The elves were also ready to shoot with a crossbow, they aimed at their opponent while they rode on horses. At this time, one of the launched shells was flying in the sky not far from the guys. It was an excellent launch, it hit right next to the installation, and neutralized several opponents. The enemy's tower immediately caught fire, it was made of wood, so it was not difficult to burn it down. Everything around was covered in fire, it spread further and further to the enemy installations. Kashuera ordered that the enemies should not be spared, everyone had to kill them so that their comrades would survive. All the elves were determined, they were encouraged by the girl's words, the guys rushed into battle. Kashuera ordered them to shoot without hesitation, Captain Khan was also among them. Kashuera screamed loudly, she ordered her squad to shoot and not spare the enemies. The elves who were riding behind her took bows and arrows in their hands and began to carry out the girl's orders. The elves were right on target, they neutralized several opponents by hitting them in the body. One of the enemies told the others to take shields to protect themselves from the enemy's arrows. The enemy army took out huge iron shields, they could well have saved them. One of the enemies signaled to the flying monsters that they could attack. At that moment, he was hit in the head and the enemy fell lifelessly to the ground. Ka-Shuera was militant, she ordered to destroy the enemy base as much as possible. At this time, flying monsters attacked the allies from the sky, they were merciless. However, the guys successfully shot back at these monsters, and with the victory over the monster, the rider also fell. The elves skillfully chopped off the necks of their enemies, drops of blood splashed around. Their enemies were amazed at the guys' high fighting skills. The enemies fled in horror from the approaching horde of elves, led by Ka-Shuera. The girl stopped them, she said that there was no need to chase them. It seemed to her that it would be better to concentrate on hitting the target. The girl had a strategy. One of the elves took out a small projectile that was located on his belt. The elf skillfully threw a projectile at the enemy. The projectile rolled and reached its target, he fell to the ground. At this moment, Captain Khan took aim using a sniper rifle, he had a plan. The shell rolled straight to the foot of the enemy installation, it had to be blown up. Previously, the guys discussed that these shells are not made of gunpowder, so it won't work any other way. Lu was trying to make it explode if he hit it. However, this turned out to be too small, magic still has limits. Captain Khan asked if it was different from what erection troops use. He had no idea how magic worked. Lu explained that it was just like a fireball, the boy enchanted the fireball. The captain asked if there was any other way, the boy flew up to him and said that there was only this. The captain said that in the world where he came from, a process called a trigger was necessary for the explosion of gunpowder. Lu explained that it might be a little confusing, but it looked like an explosive bullet created by magic. The captain understood everything, and an idea came to him on how to use Lu's inventions. You had to throw this shell and shoot this bullet at him, then he would explode. Then the plan can work. Lu gave Captain Khan one of the magic bullets. The man was about to implement his plan, he was aiming a sniper rifle at a shell. The opponents were not going to relax and let Captain Khan do this, but Ka-Shuera protected him. She told Captain Khan to quickly focus on his task and act. The elves boldly ran into battle, they threw shells at the enemy's combat installations. Captain Khan was very tense, he hoped that his bullet would hit the target. The guy fired, but he didn't hit the first time. The bullet turned out to be to the right of the projectile. Ka-Shuera asked what he was doing and told Captain Khan to pull himself together and shoot again. The guy clenched his teeth, realizing that he had no second chance to make a mistake. The captain fired another bullet, it flew straight towards the target. The bullet reached the projectile, a strong explosion was heard, which destroyed the enemy installation. Ka-Shuera was very happy, she was inspired by this hit. Ka-Shuera told her squad not to allow anyone to touch the captain and to protect him. The elves understood the girl's order, they were going to do so in order to bring their victory closer. Captain Khan repeated the same actions again, he aimed at another shell. The hit was again accurate, another enemy installation fell. The enemies were not going to surrender, one of their commanders raised his hand and was about to order his men to act. The opponents took bows and arrows in their hands and aimed at the guys. Ka-Shuera quickly reacted, she ordered to raise the shields and not allow a single hit. The elves obeyed her unquestioningly, they did everything as the girl said. The opponents continued to shoot with arrows, there was a high probability that they would hit the guys. The elves could barely hold on, there were a lot of arrows, it was hard for them to resist. Ka-Shuera was also hit, fortunately the arrow was in her shoulder, it was not a serious wound. The girl looked carefully at Captain Khan, she was waiting for a signal from him. The guy exhaled, he did everything right and lowered his sniper rifle. The guy looked at Ka-Shuera in surprise, at that time she broke off the arrow sticking in her shoulder. Captain Khan smiled and nodded to the girl, meaning that she could act. Ka-Shuera was inspired, she understood what the guy meant. The girl released a light sign into the sky, as the guys agreed before. Everything around lit up with a bright blue glow, all the fighters saw it. Imosul was flying on his dragon at that time, he turned around and looked at the blue flash of light. The man knew exactly what she meant, he grinned, the whole fight was turning in their favor. Everything around lit up with a bright blue glow, all the fighters saw it. Immosul was flying on his dragon at that time. He turned around and looked at the blue flash of light. The man knew exactly what she meant. He grinned. The whole fight was turning in their favor. Immosul ordered the rest of the elves to be ready to attack. And all the elves riding on dragons hastened to attack the enemy. They resolutely flew forward. Immosul was the first to fly at the head of his detachment. He was determined for a speedy victory. The fighting dragons approached the flying monsters like a wedge. They also did not sit idly by and flew into a counterattack. The dragons maneuvered and flew around the monsters from behind. The elves launched their arrows straight at the riders. The dragons and elves were heading towards a detachment of enemies near the forest. Immosul ordered his men to drop their ammunition. He grinned slyly. Bags of ammunition were attached to the dragons' uniforms, and the elves dropped them on their opponents. Each such dragon had 4 bags, resulting in a lot of ammunition capable of causing damage. The bags flew down at high speed towards opponents. This was an innovative development. Shells fell from the bag into each other. There were many of them in each bag. The opponents saw a hail of shells raining down on them from the sky. They looked at it in surprise. The shells reached their target, many explosions were heard, and the opponents were defeated. Ka-Shuera ordered her people to retreat. The girl shouted loudly. The elves listened to her. They all moved straight behind Ka-Shuera towards the city walls. Count Lemisandro looked intently at the battlefield. He was expecting something. The count was waiting for the right moment to begin the attack again. He carefully watched the explosions. Count Lemisandro told his men that they could attack. He raised his hand and waved it. Lu was shocked by the scale of the battle. He looked out to see a sign from Count Lemisandro. Lu understood everything. He passed the signal to one of the knights. The knight also understood everything. He raised his hand up and commanded to start firing at the enemy. At the same second, many projectiles flew from the catapults behind the wall. They were heading straight towards the enemy. The shells were flying at great speed, carrying destructive power within them. The shells reached their destination. Loud explosions were heard, destroying everything in the area. Ka-Shuera looked warily to the side. She was waiting for further instructions. The girl saw a crowd of warriors approaching from the city walls. It was a prince. He led an army of knights in armor. Knight Ramish gave a sign to his people. They knew exactly what he meant. The army acted harmoniously. The guys on the city wall raised flags with a red stripe in the center of the canvas. The others began to pour the hot liquid from the jugs. They flooded enemy installations with it. Everything was precisely planned. After that, one of the knights fired a flaming arrow from his bow. It headed straight towards the tower. The tower instantly burst into flames. It burned with a bright flame. It was a success. At this time, the two armies ran towards each other. They were about to fight in a mortal duel. The prince looked to the side. He was quickly going to assess the situation on the battlefield. Ka-Shuera looked at the prince resolutely. She was ready to tear and throw. The prince shouted loudly. He ordered to destroy every single one. Prince Ryan's army moved to attack their opponents. They did not intend to leave a trace of them. Elves on battle dragons watched the battle from a bird's eye view. Immosul was ready to lead his army to help the allies. The elves riding on dragons flew into battle. They were already ready to win this fight. Suddenly, a bright light appeared near the battle site. It blinded everyone present. The prince looked at him in surprise. This was not part of his plans. He was surprised. Count Lemisandro also looked at the bright flash in bewilderment. What he saw shocked the man. From a flash of light a huge paw of some creature appeared. It was a monster that looked like a rhinoceros with one eye, and the opponents were riding on it. The elves' horses were frightened by these creatures. They could not run into battle and kicked. The prince was angry. He did not expect that the enemy had such strength. Armin looked at the huge creatures with horror, but he did not panic in spirit and was determined. The man sat astride his creature. He was ready to lead the army behind him. Armin told his people not to die in vain. They listened to him carefully. The elves stood at attention. Armin continued his inspiring speech. The man shouted that if his people were going to die, they should take at least one with them. He ordered them all to go on the attack. The entire allied army ran into battle. Ka-Shuera had a warlike appearance. She was determined to stand to the end in this battle. Captain Khan pulled himself together and steeled himself. He had never participated in such a battle, but was ready to do everything possible. He ordered them all to go on the attack. The entire allied army ran into battle. Ka-Shuera had a warlike appearance. She was determined to stand to the end in this battle. Captain Khan pulled himself together and steeled himself. He had never participated in such a battle, but was ready to do everything possible. All the elves were determined to win. They followed their commander without a drop of fear. The enemy monsters confidently approached the guys. They had a terrifying appearance and posed a great danger. One of the rhinoceros monsters suddenly jumped up on its hind legs. It was about to defeat the enemy army. The rhinoceros stomped on the ground with its huge paws. It scattered several elves on horses at once. Armin was angry. He was going to fight the monster with a ball. The man hit it. Blood gushed around. He ordered the others not to scatter, not to retreat, otherwise they would die. There was a mess all around. Blood was pouring everywhere. The elves made their way through the monsters to the opponents. They ran towards them on horses. A fierce battle began, and both sides were determined to win. The elves had excellent combat experience. They skillfully evaded enemy attacks. The elves were armed with spears. They reached the necks of their enemies with them. Count Lemisandro understood that they were outnumbered, but the battle was not just a race of strength. The man was on the city wall. He carefully watched the progress of the battle. The count was thinking about tactics. He had to drill a road on impulse, start a forest invasion, and in the blink of an eye a gap would form. He had to not miss it. Count Lemisandro knew that in the end he had to deal a mortal blow to his enemies and victory would be in his pocket. At this time, the battle continued. All participants made every effort to win. Captain Khan also fought valiantly and provided gunfire support to his army. Seeing the young man, Count Lemisandro remembered his request earlier before the battle. At the time, the prince did not think that this would be enough to turn the tide of the battle by simply neutralizing the catapults. Captain Cowan agreed with him. It was also a little risky, but the risk was worth it. Lou was also going to offer something. He flew to the guys. The boy pointed to the map of the future battlefield. He showed 2 places. Everyone listened to him attentively. Pedra sat on her throne. Her word was the last. Lou proposed his strategy, and if they did this, the enemies would have no choice but to retreat. Pedra asked why they couldn't use magic. Lou explained that this was impossible. Perhaps the archmage could handle it, but the target area was too vast. Even any large-scale magic will not be enough to deal enough damage to the target. Lou believed there was no choice but for someone to get there. It was necessary to directly activate the magic for the boy's plan to succeed. Ka Shuera and Captain Khan took up this task. The girl asked how far away it was. Captain Khan noticed that there was no signal yet. They could not act willfully. The girl screamed and asked what he was doing. At first he only works when everyone dies. Ka Shuera entered. She looked at the prince, who galloped bravely towards his opponents. The prince said that almost everything. He mercilessly cut down the enemies one by one. The prince asked to hold out a little longer. Their plan was almost ready for implementation. On the battlefield, neither side was victorious. They had significant losses, and the battle was very brutal. Captain Khan turned and looked at the walls of the city. He was waiting for the signal. Lou noticed this. He knew what to do and how to put their plan into action. The boy began to cast magic, and several children took up magic with him. Lou sent a blue flash into the sky using his magical powers. The flash was very bright. It seemed to be a signal. It illuminated everything around. Captain Khan only had 1 cartridge. Lou said he barely had time to fire it. However, as Lou said, the cartridge has enormous power. Ken could not even dream of such magic. Therefore, fearing problems, Captain Khan did not even load it in advance. The man loaded the sniper rifle with this cartridge and was about to pull the trigger. Captain Khan had no chance to fail. He only had 1 attempt to change the tide of the battle. The captain took aim. In his field of vision there was a huge creature similar to a rhinoceros, but this did not suit him. He moved his sight to another place on the battlefield, but it was almost the same there. The search continued. Finally, the man aimed his sight at a huge stone with a round mark in the shape of an eye on it. This was it. Captain Khan saw him. This was what he was looking for. The man was ready to shoot. Captain Khan pulled the trigger. He had the enormous responsibility of turning the tide of the battle. The bullet flew out of the sniper rifle with great speed. Khan was confident in the accuracy of the shot. She left a blue trail behind her that stretched all the way to her target. The opponents did not understand what was happening and what this blue stripe was. They stopped and looked at it. The bullet began to activate magic. While still in flight, it glowed bright yellow. The projectile reached its destination. It hit the stone right in the drawn eye. A magic circle activated around the stone. it was all thanks to Lu and his magic. A stream of light rose straight from the stone, it was supposed to help the guys win. Over the entire city, the northern lights appeared in the sky and magic circles appeared. The power of magic was so great that the city and the area trembled and strange sounds were heard. They were supported by the mages who stood on the walls, they directed all their forces into magic circles in the sky. This power illuminated the magic circles, they gained energy and were ready to activate. The enemies did not understand what it was, they looked at the sky in surprise. The magic circles activated, and many lightning bolts and discharges appeared from them, which were directed towards the enemy army. The rhinoceros monsters screamed in agony, they were scared and did not know what to do. This light was shining more and more intensely, lightning was emitted from it, striking enemies. The prince's enemies screamed, lightning, without exception, swept away everything in its path. The prince himself was surprised by such extraordinary power of magic, he looked at the battlefield in confusion. The prince thought it was time to leave, he and his knights headed towards the side of the wall. After using magic, the battlefield looked eerie, with incinerated bodies of monsters and humans lying everywhere. The elves themselves looked at this, they were amazed at the strength of their allies. The knight told them to come to their senses and not leave the line, they need to be vigilant because the battle is not over yet. The rest of the opponents were very scared, they did not know what to do or how to escape. The smartest decision for them was to escape, all the remnants of the army headed into the thick of the forest to survive. The knight ordered to chase after them so as not to miss the enemies, no one should have been left alive. The elves caught up with their opponents and were merciless, they stuck their spears right into them. The commander watched everything from the city wall. All the fighters were very happy about their successes, all the fighters rejoiced, enjoying their success. Pedra breathed a sigh of relief, her army was able to defeat the enemies and save the inhabitants of the city. Count Lemesandro believed that it would be good to end this with just one bullet. Thanks to this shot they won, but it didn't last long. Ka Shuera and Captain Can also understood this, they looked at each other warily. If support does not arrive on time, the army will not be able to maintain its victory. They wouldn't hold out for another day and this castle would fall, so it was too early to rejoice. Riser Ramesh asked Count Lemesandro if they should also go in pursuit, he explained that they needed to protect the castle. At this time, a detachment of the knight Helishut made his way through the forest thickets. They suddenly heard a strange sound, all the guys turned around. Something squeaked from behind a bush, it seemed to be a message from the allies. One of Helishut's guys went into the bushes to find out what was happening. He replied that the commander of the Albinu fortress would arrive first, and Knight Helishut expected this. Sir thought that there was no doubt about his loyalty to His Majesty the Emperor. The only thing Knight Helishut was worried about was that support would not arrive too late. At this time, the prince was sitting in the meeting hall, the gathering of reinforcements progressed without problems, they received information from Helishut that they would arrive tomorrow afternoon. Ka Shuera, Captain Can and Lu understood that most likely they would not be supported as much, they looked downcast. The prince thoughtfully went to the window, he looked out at the street and was upset. There they treated the wounds of wounded soldiers, there were many of them, all the residents helped in any way they could. Captain Khan understood that the prince must be worried, they no longer had any magic supplies. Even the shells Lu made were nearing their end, there was less and less chance of victory. Captain Khan thought maybe because if this continues, they won't be able to hold out until reinforcements arrive. The prince decided to ask the opinion of his subjects what they thought about battle tactics. Captain Khan decided to speak out and offer his own version of the development of events. At this time, lights were burning in the forest, it looked like reinforcements were moving towards the guys. The three men, along with the knight Helishut, sat and conferred in a circle. The first man's name was Baron Irison, he was the head of the Albinu Irison fortress. The second was called Viscount Greg, he was also the head of the fortress, Doran Greg. And the third for reinforcements was Viscount Lajun, the head of the Kaur fortress. Helishut, on behalf of the prince, thanked them all for gathering so quickly despite the suddenness of the request. Baron Irison said it was not worth wasting time. The man was surprised that it was all reinforcements, there were few people nearby, they were the only ones who responded the fastest. Baron Irison believed that they all simply did not want to participate. Helishut tried to explain that most likely it was all due to the distance. Helishut added that a messenger from Count Leo had just arrived. All the men were instantly inspired, the appearance of Count Leo changed everything. Einisin asked how many troops needed to be mobilized. Only 16,000 infantrymen were needed. All three ended up with 3,400 people. The combination with the troops of Count Leo will be about 20,000 people. One should not forget about Count Lemesandro. Irisin changed in an instant. He thought that they might even be able to defeat the enemy. Helishut thought that there should be enough reinforcements. He hoped that they would hold out until then. Helishut suggested performing as soon as the sun rose. Irisin agreed with him that before Gravely arrived they had to go first. Irisin told the other two to get up because they should hurry to get to Lothiador before sunset. Meanwhile, the situation in Lothiador was tense. Everyone was preparing for the continuation of hostilities. Guards stood on the walls of the city. They watched for the appearance of opponents. The guards signaled that they had noticed something in the distance. It seemed they were being attacked again. In front of the city wall, enemy monsters began to be seen from the fog. There were a huge number of them. Troops were stationed in front of the monsters, ready to attack. Knight Ramish understood that after what they did yesterday, they were still a strong army. The general said that yesterday was just the beginning and today everything will be different. He laughed evilly and said that this battle must definitely end before sunset. He advised Count Lemesandro to take care of his neck, and raised his hand up. As he was about to signal his troops to advance, their commander lowered his hand low. The enemy troops were ready. They stood in formation, waiting for the signal. On the city wall, everyone carefully watched the advance of the enemy army. Towers approached the walls. The magicians of the allied army tried to stop them. Using their power, they burned them. Count Lemesandro walked to the edge of the wall and looked down. He was sorry. If it weren't for the outer fortress, if there was doom, they would have been able to buy a little more time and they would have had a better chance of winning. Count Lemesandro wondered what to do next. They had to come up with a plan of action to defeat the enemy. Knight Ramish asked the Count what they should do next. They made preparations as per Captain Khan's suggestion, but if they were here, they might get stuck. Knight Ramish was very nervous. He said that there was no time and demanded an urgent decision from Count Lemesandro. The man knew that there was a secondary road, but if a situation arose that they had to leave the castle, it was not a fact that the princess and prince would be able to climb that ladder. At this time, the opponents drove up to the city gates in huge cars. They had a drill in front. They tried to break through the gates with it and enter the city. However, the one who was driving this car was stopped and shot in the head. Captain Khan was responsible for this. He stood with his sniper rifle on the wall. The guy sighed, because there was nothing more he could do with a sniper rifle. Captain Khan looked at Count Lemesandro. It seemed that he still had not made a decision. Everyone understood that in today's battle it was necessary to gain time, not to win. Retreating like this would not be easy, even if you just gain time. Count Lemesandro finally gave the order. He ordered the fire to be lit. Knight Ramish listened to him. Knight Ramish raised his hand and gave his subordinates the command that Count Lemesandro had given. The archers were ready. They stood on the wall and lit their arrows as they were ordered. The archers fired. They released their arrows at their opponents. This was, if not the only weapon in their arsenal. The arrows fell directly on the cars. They had to set them on fire and neutralize them. Flames broke out all around, engulfing more and more structures. The fire spread to the enemy towers. The enemies screamed loudly at them, burning alive. The opponents ran away from the fire. They tried to escape with all possible strength and avoid death. While they were running away, archers were shooting at them from the wall, and they clearly hit the target. The opposing general saw their actions and believed that they were not going to fight normally. They were just stalling for time. He understood perfectly well that they were planning to hold out until reinforcements arrived, but no one knows whether their plan would come true, and the war does not always go according to calculations. At this time, reinforcements were already on the way. They were led by Helishut. The army consisted of mounted infantry. Helishut suggested that Baron Irisin take a break. The man replied that it was impossible. His Highness was desperately waiting for reinforcements in the form of them. Knight Helishut was upset and noticed that the warriors were very exhausted and could not continue their journey. A woman wearing high black boots suddenly appeared in front of the army. She looked angry and said they didn't have to worry about it anymore. Baron Irisin asked who she was and how she dared to block the path of his army. The woman laughed evilly. She was clearly not friendly towards the guys. The woman snapped her fingers and said, "If you are so curious, then the Baron should go and ask himself." At this moment, the army knights looked up in surprise, and a strange sound was heard. foreshadowing danger. Knight Helishut also looked at him. He was very surprised by what he saw. He did not know what to do. A huge stone flew straight from the sky towards the army. It seemed to come out of nowhere. All the knights began to run away. They tried to dodge and avoid participation. Some knights still failed to escape. They fell under this huge stone and were crushed. Baron Irisin did not understand what kind of strange power the girl had and what she wanted. The Baron called the woman crazy. He definitely wanted to kill her so that the soldier's soul could rest in peace. Baron Irising did not have time to finish speaking when he suddenly coughed up blood. The man felt unwell. Knight Helishut looked at his ally in fear. He was alarmed by such an unexpected change in his condition. Baron Irising looked down angrily. He did not understand what had happened. It turns out that this woman pierced Baron Irising's body with a sword from behind. Blood gushed from the man's chest. The woman promised to personally rip the throat of the naughty pig. As soon as she dealt with one opponent, the woman decided to defeat the rest. She pushed off the ground. The woman looked angrily at the others, wondering who would be the next to start a fight with her. Opposite her stood Viscount Greg. He took a fighting stance and was ready to fight the woman. The Viscount decisively ran towards the woman and was about to attack her. He was ready to avenge the death of his friend. Viscount Greg and the woman grappled in a duel. They crossed their balls, and the battle began. There were many boulders standing near the cliff, ready to cause devastating damage. These cobblestones began to roll down the cliff. These were also the tricks of this woman. The stones flew down with great speed, and no one could hide from them. The cobblestones fell on the remnants of the army. They crushed several more soldiers. They screamed in agony. Knight Helishut dragged Baron Irising on his shoulders. Behind him stood the remnants of his army, who did not understand what to do. Riser Helishut thought that this was madness, and thus they would all be defeated. He had to make a decision. The man thought, a difficult choice lies ahead, how to save who he can. Knight Helishut made a difficult decision. He ordered the soldiers to disperse and flee into the forest. Helishut believed that otherwise they would all be killed. Viscount Lajun did not agree. He did not want to run away cowardly. Helishut explained that their task is to save the soldiers in any way and get to His Highness. Their first priority was not winning. Now everyone needs to worry about how to maintain more soldiers. Viscount Lajun once again reflected on the situation and the words of Knight Helishut. He still thought that this was not a bad decision, and the man was right. He decided to go first. Helishut did not expect such a reaction from Viscount Lajun. He was surprised by this decision. Like Helishut said, if they didn't keep their soldiers, there was no point in sending them then. Knight Helishut barely held Baron Irisin in her arms. They looked after Viscount Lajun. The Viscount mounted his horse and rushed away. His Highness the Prince was waiting not for them, but for the soldiers. At this time, Viscount Greg was still fighting bravely with the woman. He tried his best to defeat her. Knight Helishut loaded the body of Baron Irising onto his horse. He needed to follow his plan. Knight Helishut climbed onto his horse and led the remnants of his army behind him to the east to escape. Meanwhile, the battle for Lothiador was in full swing. Everything around was blazing with fire. Allied soldiers fired arrows at the enemies, setting fire to their towers. The enemies screamed loudly. They were burned alive by the flames. The prince carefully watched the battlefield. Standing on the city wall, he thought about what to do next. Count Lemisandro understood that this was terrible, but it was necessary for the sake of victory. The prince knew that they too were his father's subjects. It was painful for the prince to watch people suffer. He understood that they were killing them with their own hands. Everything around was on fire. The opponents burned one by one and screamed in agony. The enemy commander watched the progress of the battle. He looked at everything carefully, sitting on his black horse. Their commander smiled. He was not at all frightened by this situation. It seemed he had a plan of action. At that moment, some strange sounds were heard. Everything around began to shake. The prince and Count Lemisandro watched everything in surprise. They did not understand what was happening and did not expect such a turn of events. Dust rose all around. It was like an earthquake. The earth began to crack. No one understood what was happening and what danger it could pose. The knights did not understand why the earth began to crack. They paused from their battle and looked at these phenomena. At that moment, something rose straight out of the ground. Something rose up and drilled through everything in its path. There were several such phenomena. The prince and Count Lemisandro watched in surprise. The prince did not know what it was. He was very excited. He ordered the magicians to attack as quickly as possible. These strange boulders destroyed everything in their path, they knocked down towers and walls, they carried great danger. These phenomena rose on the walls of the city, they could be seen from the inside, no one understood what it was. People watched all this in surprise, they had never seen this before and did not understand how to deal with it. Count Lemesandro was horrified by what he saw in front of him, he looked at this natural phenomenon in a stupor. The prince was scared, the man was confused and did not understand how to proceed. It turns out they were huge worms with a horn on their heads, they crawled out of the ground and roared loudly. These creatures began to hit the wall with their horn, acting like a drill. The wall was collapsing right before our eyes, bricks were flying everywhere, knocking down people standing on the wall. Count Lemesandro ordered arrows to be fired to stop this monster. His order was obeyed, the soldiers readied their bows and arrows and began to defend themselves. The magicians also brought their powers into action, they directed their energy towards the monster. The monster screamed from the attacks of the allies, the guys tried with all their might to defeat the enemy. However, it was not so easy to defeat him, the huge worm again hit the wall with its entire mass. The dragon riders were the next to join the battle, they saw this monster from a bird's eye view. The riders flew towards the worm and began throwing bombs at it, the creature screaming in pain. Lu watched this whole situation, he also wanted to help defeat this creature and was thinking about a plan of action. Lu ordered to activate the catapults and fire projectiles at the monster from behind the wall. They did so, the cannonballs hit the monster directly, loud explosions were heard, the creature screamed. However, all these techniques were useless, the monster hit the guy's settings with its tail. It moved very quickly, the worm crawled underground and destroyed everything in its path. The monster easily swallowed the catapults and the soldiers along with them, the creature was very dangerous. Captain Khan was shocked, he had never seen anything like this, and did not know what to do with it. The prince was shocked, he did not understand what kind of thing it was and where it came from. He was about to go into battle, but Count Lemesandro stopped him and grabbed the man by the hand. The prince got angry, he thought that the count was now telling him to surrender and leave his soldiers. The count understood their chances better than anyone, and that this difficult choice had to be made for the good of everyone else. The count and the prince carefully looked at the battlefield, the battle was not unfolding in their favor. It seemed to Count Lemesandro that now was the time to retreat, this would be the best decision for everyone. The prince asked if this meant they had lost, Count Lemesandro believed that this battle was clearly lost. However, the war was still not over, they still had a chance of victory. They are much stronger enemies than the guys expected, but nothing can be changed here. The prince was angry, he did not understand what he should do, whether he should surrender now, he did not understand how the count was inviting him to suffer shameful defeat. The count tried to calm the prince, he believed that he should gain real power. The count knelt down and asked the prince to step into the situation, because he and all of his highness's soldiers had already sworn allegiance to him. If he ordered to go into the fire, he would no doubt go if it would help him win, he is ready to die for the prince, but not today. Today they had to get out of this alive, thrust a sword into the heart of their enemies, the day would come when they would wash away this shame with blood. Count Lemesandro was ready to lay down his life to present the prince with the head of the commander of the defeated army. He asked the prince to survive and lead their army forward to victory. The prince was surprised by such sincere and desperate words of Count Lemesandro, he wondered what to do next. The prince raised his staff, he was about to make an announcement and decide the fate of his people. The prince ordered his army to leave the castle, this was the only possible solution to this situation. The knights began to retreat, they needed to move away from their fighting positions. The prince came down from the city wall, he was going to help his soldiers and do everything possible. The prince ordered his people to be sure to survive, because they no longer had another chance to win. At that time, the knight Helishut was walking through the forest with a supporting army, they walked carefully through the forest so as not to stumble upon the enemy. Knight Helishut looked worriedly at the wounded Baron Irison. Count Greg told Knight Helishut not to blame himself, because thanks to his quick sober judgment they were able to save lives and collect such a quantity. The guys managed to save the maximum number of the relief army, all the knights walked through the forest to the place. Greg believed that the prince would definitely give the knight Helishut a big reward, the guy didn't do this because he wants a reward. Greg believed that the knight was not only brave but also gifted with absolute loyalty. Viscount Greg was glad that there were such brave and selfless people in their kingdom, the man smiled. Viscount Greg noticed that Viscount Lajun was late. This seemed strange to him. The man thought something might have gone wrong and he might have been attacked. A strange sound was heard around, the knights became alert, everyone was ready to take out their weapons. The knights looked around in surprise, they tried to understand what kind of sound was coming from. At that moment, Viscount Lajun appeared right in front of them, sitting astride his horse. Everything was fine with him, he looked serious and concentrated. Night came, the army needed rest, they decided to make a break in a forest clearing. Knight Helishut explained that as soon as they crossed this mountain, they would find themselves in Lafayador. Lajun said that the runaway soldiers would return soon. Viscount Greg hoped that Baron Eilising would be able to wake up, and he needed rest. It seems the enemies are no longer pursuing them. Viscount Lajun believed that they must be busy, and perhaps even completely retreated. Viscount Greg and Knight Helishut looked at him in surprise, they did not quite understand what the man meant. Viscount Lajun remembered that it was necessary to contact Count Leo. Knight Helishut sent a messenger to him. The road is a little confusing, so the knight thought it would be better to climb onto the ridge and have a look around. Viscount Lajun said that he had heard rumors from the outside. Knight Helishut did not understand what the man was talking about. Lajun heard that His Highness Prince Orang took a stranger as his servant. Knight Helishut understood what the man was talking about. He explained that this stranger was not a servant. It was about Captain Can, he simply accompanied. The knight believed that he was very capable. Greg believed that he must really be capable if he was so highly rated, and besides, the prince himself kept him by his side. Greg asked Knight Helishut to tell him what kind of person this stranger was. Knight Helishut began to talk about the first time he saw Captain Khan. At this time, there was an excited atmosphere in Lafayador, people were panicking, everyone was scared. The princes tried with all their might to coordinate the crowds of people, they showed where people should hide. The elves fled in horror, some children remained lost without their parents and fell to the ground. Pedra saw one such child, she was very excited and wanted to help them, but Robera said that they needed to hurry. Pedra really wanted to take this little girl with her, but someone else helped her. It was Armin, he sat the child on his shoulder and quickly ran to save him. Pedra happily looked after the guy, she was very glad that there was such a brave man. All the elves ran to the shelter in panic, they were scared and did not know what to do next. Lafayador was in danger of enemy penetration, they were advancing closer and closer. The magicians tried to delay them and prevent them from passing, they used their powers on their enemies. The knights also fought with them, and they were even ready to die, but not allow the enemies to pass. A young girl tried to save one elderly elf, she led her by the arm into the shelter. Right behind these two there was a huge monster, Kashuera saw it, the girl turned around. This monster swung his weapon at the pity elf, he was ready to kill them. However, at that moment someone shot directly at the monster's head, the shot was very accurate. The monster fell lifeless, the creature was defeated. Kashuera shouted to the elves to run away quickly, and to seek shelter, it was dangerous on the street. They shot at the monster with a sniper rifle, the man was a professional and knew exactly what he was doing. Captain Khan stood on the city wall, providing sniper support to his army. She looked through the scope and saw another monster approaching civilians. Captain Khan wanted to save at least one more person, he was going to shoot. And birds were flying peacefully in the sky, it looked like the battle was over, everything was quiet around. A rider rode up to the walls of Lafayadora and stopped. The man looked at the lifeless city, the walls of the city were broken through by terrifying forces. There were corpses of soldiers lying all around, the scene was terrible. A huge hole was punched in the wall of the city, this was done by that monster, the worm of enemies. The man who arrived was fully equipped in knight's armor, he watched everything with sadness. The man was angry, he snorted, he was saddened by the defeat of the prince's army. The man took off his helmet, it looked like there was no one to fight with. The man had long black hair, he thought that he was late for the main battle. His army asked what they should do now, the man was about to give them an order. The man angrily clenched the reins, he thought about how he could help his allies. The man gave the order to pursue the prince, the troops of Baron Irison will soon join, so one of the knights should stay here with 100 people. They didn't know where exactly the guy was going, the man thought that from now on they would do that. A large bird was flying in the sky, the man raised his hand and called the bird to him. The bird clearly recognized the man, it quickly flew down. The bird landed on the man's hand, the bird looked like a large black eagle. The man stroked the bird's head, it was his pet. The man explained that he foresaw this outcome of events and took this bird on purpose. The battle was over, Captain Ken looked into the sky, and his eyes were blinded by the bright sun. The man closed his eyes. A large bird was flying peacefully in the sky above them, everything was calm around. Ka Shuera asked Captain Kan what it was, if the man was seeing something and what was happening. At that moment, someone shouted that we needed to organize a small rest stop. Ka Shuera was very happy about this, she fell to the ground from fatigue. All the soldiers were exhausted, there were many wounded, the guys helped each other as best they could. Captain Khan watched with sadness the consequences of the fighting, he was upset that he could not win. The man was also very tired, he sat down under a tree next to Ka Shuera. The girl hoped that he did not blame himself for what happened. Ka Shuera offered Ken food and said that there was no need to blame himself, the defeat in the battle was not his fault. Ka Shuera also looked sadly at what was happening around her, she felt sorry for her people. The captain asked when they fight, sometimes they win and sometimes they lose. The prince stood nearby along with the rest of the captains. Ka Shuera was very angry, she was hurt by the man's words, she considered them nonsense. If they don't fight, no one will know, but if they decide to fight, they must win. If they play, what they see now will happen, there will be many crippled lives and destinies. That is why she advised Kan to pull himself together and rest when possible, then he won't lose the next fight. Captain Kan still decided to eat, he listened to Ka Shuera and calmed down a little. He recalled the events of the past when he was still in his world. His younger sister appeared before his eyes, asking if she was beautiful. The captain said that the girl was very beautiful, his younger sister was Radha. She asked if Captain Kong would go with her to the entrance ceremony. The man replied that of course it would pass, how could he miss such an important event? His sister was very happy. At this time the captain looked sadly at their family portrait that hung on the wall. He mentally turned to his father and said that So Yun had become so grown up and had already entered university. His father didn't have to worry, Captain Khan was going to take care of them, so he could rest easy. After some time, Captain Kan walked with his colleague along the corridor, they were calmly talking about something. Captain Khan reached into his pocket for his phone, he wanted to see what time it was. The man was surprised to see notifications on his phone about missed calls, there were as many as 12 of them. The man dialed this number, he asked why they called him, and was very surprised by the answer. The captain's face immediately changed and he was covered in cold sweat, his friend asked what happened. Captain Kan quickly ran away, something bad had obviously happened, he was in a hurry to help. Captain Khan was very excited, he was horrified by what happened. Captain Kan ran to the hospital, his aunt was already waiting there, all in tears, and at that time an operation was underway in the operating room. Captain Kong hugged her aunt as his sister lay on the operating table. Finally, the operation was over, the surgeon came out of the operating room and was ready to tell everything. The man told Captain Kong what happened to So Yun, how the operation went and its prognosis. Captain Kan was very worried, he was worried about his sister, and could not find a place for himself. At this time, So Yun was already in intensive care, her vital signs were stable. The girl was on a ventilator, she was lying unconscious, her case was serious. Captain Kan clenched his hands into fists, he needed to avoid returning to his real world. He thought that So Yun shouldn't give up either, she needed to come out of her coma and come back too. Ka Shuera did not understand what Captain Kan said, she looked at him in surprise, the man said that it was nothing. A horseman galloped along the path, he shouted that the enemies were pursuing them all the way to the Shant River. Everyone around looked in surprise, they were angry with the current situation and their situation. Ka Shuera was furious, she was angry that the enemies did not completely surrender. Captain Kan understood that if this continued, they would probably be caught up and attacked from behind. In order for him to return he needed to reach the capital and meet with the Archmage. Khan was very serious, he stood up and was ready to propose his plan of action. The captain said that such a retreat was probably what the enemy needed. Count Lemisandro did not understand what the guy meant. Khan explained that they cover a distance in a whole day that they would normally cover in half a day. Count Lemisandro asked what to do then, did Khan really propose to leave the wounded here? The prince and Armin looked at Captain Khan in surprise, they wanted to hear what the man would say next. Captain Cowan proposed creating a stop line, this is often used in War on Earth. Count Lemisandro was surprised at this proposal from Captain Khan, it had not occurred to him. Count Lemesandro asked who would do it, because they were being pursued by tens of thousands of enemies. He was not sure that it would work. The Count asked if they set up the line of containment he mentioned, how much could they slow down the enemy's pursuit. Captain Khan knew that it was impossible to tie the legs of tens of thousands of enemies in the mountains where there were no fortresses, so he had to do it the local way. The captain asked to give him 500 soldiers, 30 wizards, then he would delay the persecution. Everyone around was shocked by such a proposal. They were not sure that the guy could cope with so many resources. Count Lemesandro got angry, he shouted at Khan and asked what to talk about, but the prince stopped him. The prince asked if Captain Khan was given soldiers, how long would he be able to delay the enemies? The captain could delay them for a day, perhaps two, then during this time they might have time to get with the refugees to the Croson Gorge. The prince think about the captain's proposal, he hoped that they would be able to maintain their distance and then perhaps they could get to the gorge. The captain believed that it was necessary to make this possible, he was confident in his abilities. Captain Khan was going to save the refugees and survive himself, in which case he would be able to get to the capital. The prince thought it was a good offer, he was going to do it, Count Lemesandro was against it. The prince asked Count Lemesandro if they had other options now, but he did not know what to answer. The prince turned to the elves, they must have heard everything and understood what to do next. Armin and Robera looked at each other, they were ready to support Captain Khan's idea. Robera agreed, and they would also provide soldiers on their side. Armin was ready to single out the warriors and himself participate in delaying the opponents. At this time, not far from these important conversations there was a carriage, everything could be heard. The princess carefully watched the development of the plan of action, she was alarmed. At this time, in some distant city it was a clear day, several people were hung on the walls of the city, they were tied to sticks. All the residents of the city looked at these people with horror, it looked like they were going to be executed, people were scared. At that moment, the castle gates opened, and a woman in a white dress with long black hair came out, it looked like she was the mistress of this place. The queen and her assistant approached the edge of the wall, her servants were located around. The assistant shouted that the cleansing ritual was beginning, she was very angry, while the queen herself did not show any emotion. All the poles with people tied to them burst into flames, people were burning alive, and terrifying screams were heard. People looked at this with fear, mothers tried to hide their children from this terrible sight. The queen's assistant calmly looked at the people's torment, and it seemed that she was used to this. At that moment, the mark on her hand glowed red, it looked like a small flame. The woman turned around and walked back into the castle, she needed to do something. The woman walked along the dark corridors of the castle, she was in a hurry to find out something. The woman approached the round table, on it lay a magic ball that glowed with a bright light. The woman activated the magic ball and raised her hands to it, the princess looked at her from the ball. She had a cold, evil look, it seemed to be a communication device. Horses with knights on them were galloping through the forest, they were rushing to help. One of the men, in knightly armor, whistled, his bird flying above him. The bird flew up to the man in an instant, she was a messenger. The man stroked the bird's head, it was very smart and immediately understood what needed to be done. The bird flew away in the other direction, it had to deliver a message to someone. At this time, Knight Helishut, Viscount Greg and Viscount Lajun were looking at something in horror, everything around was covered in dust. They finally reached Lafayador and saw the terrible consequences of a brutal battle, the walls of the city were destroyed, not a soul was around. Helishut fell to the ground and began to sob, he believed that he had committed mortal sins and apologized to the prince. Viscount Lajun approached the man, he tried to cheer up the knight and said that it was not too late. The man pointed to footprints not far from them, which means that someone was able to escape. Knight Helishut realized that most likely the remnants of the army were heading north. Viscount Lajun believed that the prince escaped just before the fall of the castle along with all the soldiers. Helishut felt that this needed to be done before joining Count Leo. There were knights on the city wall at that moment, they aimed their bows and arrows at the men. The allied army was ready to defend itself, they did not expect such a turn of events. The man on the wall ordered everyone to stop, he asked if Baron Irison had arrived. Viscount Lajun explained that the Baron was badly wounded in the last battle and was now unconscious. The man asked who he was talking to now, he was not belligerent. Viscount Lajun introduced himself by his full name and said that he was from the western part of the Lufero Mountains. The man heard about this place, he was surprised that such a person would come here. The man's name was Urimes, it was an army belonging to the Black Hawk Knights under the command of Count Leo. He greeted the Viscount. The Viscount asked where Count Leo was now. The man replied that he was pursuing the prince, who seemed to be forced to leave the castle. Viscount La June exchanged glances with Knight Helishut, they understood everything, their guesses were confirmed. Knight Helishut turned around and looked at the forest, in the direction in which the prince might have gone. Knight Helishut realized that all was not lost, there was an opportunity to save their kingdom together with the prince. At that moment, the prince was walking through the forest with his army, along with the knight Ramesh. He turned around. The prince was driving behind him, he was talking with Count Lemisandro, and a carriage was following him in the place with the prince's family. The princess was running behind the carriage from behind the bushes, she was trying to catch up with the guys. The princess jumped into the carriage, where the youngest prince was waiting for her. The boy asked if her sister had found anything. The princess found it, she was holding a large golden key in her hands. The girl apologized, her father instructed her to do so. One of the knights who was riding with her in the carriage said that everything was fine. He said loudly that we could leave, and the carriage moved. The carriage was accompanied by the rest of the subjects, and refugee elves walked with them. The elf girls carried their things that they had managed to grab from their houses, they were all waiting for reinforcements. Ka Shuera was riding nearby on her horse, the girls stopped and thought about something. Ka Shuera told Captain Khan that it was time for them to take action too, she was determined. Captain Khan also thought so, there was no time to hesitate. Captain Khan looked at the prince who was riding next to him, they had a common plan on how to survive and defeat the enemy. The prince understood Captain Khan without words, he completely believed the man and was ready to follow him. Captain Khan knew exactly what to do, because he created this plan, the guy was determined. From this point on, they will begin to work on setting up traps to slow down the enemy's pursuit. The captain understood that it was not enough just to get to the capital, he had more ambitious plans. No matter what happened, he needed to win this war, because this is the only way he can return to Earth with the help of the Archmage. The guy took off his backpack with the player and began to look for something in it. The captain found a black cube in his backpack, it was some kind of combat device, he looked at it closely. A huge block of stones and sand rose up. Lu was behind this, he used his magic to dig a moat to stop the enemies, he asked if this was enough. The captain replied that everything was going well, there were 3 advance paths that enemies could take and this was the first line of defense at a fork in the road. If you leave the traps with obstacles on the 3-branched path, you can save a lot of time. At this time, the magicians were digging ditches. Ka Shuera asked what if they came by a different route. Captain Khan replied that it was necessary to force them to come precisely for this reason. Lu trusted Captain Khan, as he said, they dug trenches with magic, now they are building a line of defense, but the guy was not sure that it would really work. The captain replied that everything would be as he expected, the effect would be significant. When the First World War broke out, no one expected it to last so long, people were not prepared for it. Throughout Europe, especially in France, the atmosphere was festive, because they were confident that the war would end quickly. However, as the war gradually turned into a protracted one, trenches were created by Germany as a measure to prevent further retreat. The length of these trenches was long, and as a result the war reached a stalemate. To overcome this, new weapons have been developed, as well as tactics such as preemptive strike. The most terrible weapon was poisonous gas, but we can say that it is good that there is no possibility of using gas deposits in this world. Now there was nothing better than this to stop the advancing enemies, the guys still had no other option. The captain wanted to clarify and suggest something else, he turned to Lu for help in this matter. The trenches were dug, the magicians worked hard on it and achieved good results. Lu began to cast magic at the request of Captain Khan, the guy was very concentrated. His magic became more and more powerful, everything around lit up with a bright light that blinded those around him. Captain Khan and Ka Shuera watched this, they were confident in the success of their plan. At that moment, something appeared from underground, the soil began to move due to Lu's magic. Large sticks appeared straight up from the ground, they rushed upward, like another line of defense. These outgrowths blocked the passage along 3 paths, this was Captain Khan's plan. Captain Khan handed out black cubes to the soldiers and ordered them to carry them to the trenches. The guys placed black cubes, which apparently were weapons, in the trenches so that they could not be seen. Captain Khan looked carefully at the black club in his hands. He was going to defeat his opponents. Lu flew up to Captain Khan and asked if his plan would really work. He replied that it was impossible not to avoid what the guy saw, unless of course he was an idiot, but they would hide it in the ground. And at the moment when the opponents lean on their hands to overcome obstacles, their plan will come into action. Ka Shuera understood that as soon as their enemies suddenly encountered this, chaos would begin. Ka Shuera asked if they now needed to block other paths so that they would go this way. Captain Khan said that it would not be easy, but he was counting on the guys. Ka Shuera knew that this was all for the sake of victory, so she was ready to happily do whatever Khan said. The girl ran to the elves to explain what needed to be done. She had a plan on how to stop the enemies. The captain thought that everything should go well, as he had planned. He was confident in the success of his plan of action. At this time, the enemy army was walking through the forest. It was numerous and very warlike. One of the warriors asked what happened, another said that there was a swamp ahead and they could not go further. He pointed his hand at the swamp. It was really deep, it was impossible to get through it. The man thought about what to do next. In any case, they had to continue on their way. He turned his horse around and decided to inform his commander about this. He drove up to the man in armor and told him the current situation so that he could decide what to do. Their commander replied that even in the swamp there must be somewhere they could pass nearby. They must look for a road. The commander began to suspect that something was wrong. However, he quickly discarded these thoughts, because it didn't matter. He believed that with such small numbers, if they dared to attack directly, they would be finished, and everything will be the same as Lador fell apart. The guys from the allied army hid in trenches in the forest. They were waiting for the enemies to arrive. The soldiers carefully looked out of the trenches, trying to see if anyone was coming towards them. They were very worried and I hoped for a positive outcome of this operation. They needed to slow down the enemy by any means. The elves stood next to them. They prepared their bow and arrows to attack the enemy. Ka Shuera asked if the enemy would fall into their trap. The girl was also very worried. I wasn't sure about it. Captain Khan replied that most likely those who are too confident in themselves do not know what it means to retreat. Lu was surprised that Captain Khan thought of using magic like this. He considered him a very capable soldier. Lu recalled an event from recent battles. He was pleasantly surprised by Captain Khan's tactics in fighting. The guy found it incredible that the captain used the fact that shells do not explode immediately to shock the enemy with a late explosion when attacking. He asked to make them explode when you move them a certain distance from the magic circle. Lu was amazed at the world the captain was from. The boy did not understand what he had been doing all this time and how he ended up here. Ka Shuera believed that it would be better to turn the entire mountain into a swamp. Khan believed that if it were possible, then of course it would be a good option. The captain understood that the enemy commander-in-chief would not surrender under any circumstances. Therefore, it is not enough to simply impede progress. In a sense, the only way out is to attack and prevent movement further. At this moment, strange sounds were heard. Ka Shuera was very surprised. It seemed that their plan had come into action. Captain Khan looked out of the trench. He saw a yellow glow on the horizon. The captain realized that his enemy had fallen into his trap. They were ready to act. At this time, the opponents were dismantling the stones so that they could walk through the swamp. At that moment, strong explosions were heard. Captain Khan's trap was triggered, and the black cubes came into action. Armin believed that they needed to wait a little longer, and only then act. They hid. The elves were already ready to attack. They prepared their bow and arrows, and waited for the signal. At this time, Count Leo was riding through the forest. He was in a hurry, and was determined to help his allies. At that moment, Count Leo saw something on the ground caught his attention. Count Leo saw numerous traces left by the rescued residents and the remnants of the prince's army. One of his people asked what they should do, whether to continue pursuing the prince and his people. Count Leo asked if he thought it was too late. The man explained that it was a shame to admit, but he thought that His Highness the Prince was able to escape before they arrived. Count Leo seriously asked him if he knew why the emperor became emperor. The man began to answer that this was because he was given power from heaven. Count Leo said that this was complete nonsense. The count said that you become an emperor when you ascend to the throne yourself, and if Prince Orang dies, this is a kind of fate. Count Leo understood perfectly well what his fate was. He smiled and was not ready to admit the defeat of their allies. Count Leo ordered the pursuit to continue. He pulled the runners of his horse and set off. At this time, strong explosions were heard further in the forest. This was Captain Khan's plan to delay his enemies. The enemies believed that there was a wizard with excellent skills on the side of the Imperial army. Their priests were trying to do something. Their captain believed that while they were doing this, the prince would already cross the city. The captain understood that if they reached the gorge in this way, it would be very difficult to pursue them. The captain ordered to simply push them back. His man was surprised because of the sacrifice of the believers. The captain explained that sometimes you need to sacrifice less for more, and this is an honor for believers. The man could not contradict his captain. He obeyed and was going to carry out his order. At this time, flying monsters fought on the side of the enemies. They also carried stones. As they did this, more explosions were heard. Enemies were burned alive. Khan's plan was successful. At that moment, long green branches attacked the creatures. They wrapped around their body and pulled them along. The elves were in the trenches. They were ready to attack the enemy. Armin ordered his men to shoot. He raised his sword into the air. The elves listened to his order and fired arrows from their bows. Arrows rained down on the enemies in a hail. They pierced their bodies, and the opponents had no chance to escape. At this time, the enemy priests were already coming up with a defense plan. They stood in front of the commander-in-chief. The magicians of the enemy army began to cast spells. They were going to use magic to stop the guys. The guys were in the trenches. Fireballs were flying at them from their opponents, but they managed to avoid them. The flying creatures of the enemy army were very strong. They swung their paws, destroying everything around them. The creatures managed to get out of the green branches. They were torn into small pieces by their claws and screamed loudly. The commander-in-chief of the enemy army ordered his men to go on the attack. He was going to not give the guys a chance to win. The enemy army moved forward. They were warlike and were going to punish the non-believers. The elves were ready to defend themselves. They prepared their bow and arrows, and took aim at the enemies. The elves fired their arrows. They accurately hit the unprotected places of the enemy. The enemies fell one after another to the ground. Armin was pleased with this development of events. It seemed that everything was going according to their plan. Some of the enemies were defeated. Armin ordered his people to retreat to the second line of defense. The elves did so. They acted according to the plan. The elves jumped out of the trench and quickly ran towards the second line of defense. They had to retreat so as not to come under fire. Armin smiled. It seemed like everything was developing to their advantage. They were successfully able to detain the enemy. Armin raised his huge sword. He swung it and was about to act further. A man cut some kind of stone with enormous force. It required considerable effort, and it was necessary to act very quickly. The stone shattered into fragments. Black liquid poured from inside. The guys had everything thought out. Armin, as soon as he did this, ran away. He also retreated to the second line of defense. Opponents were chasing the man. They jumped over the trenches and were going to catch up with him. While the enemies were doing this, they stepped into the black liquid with their feet. They did not even notice that something was spilled on the ground. This was the guys' plan. They launched a fireball on the ground. They were going to blow them up. Flames appeared around. It burned stronger and stronger, burning enemies alive. Along with the rest of the elves, watched the burning spectacle from another trench. He believed that since they were going to go, they should go. Their traps were installed in every trench, and were just waiting for the enemies. The man was serious. Captain Khan sat in one trench. He watched the progress of his operation. So far everything was going fine. Ka Shuera noticed that they were better than she thought. If they could win 2 or 3 hours from each line of defense, they could win the whole day. Ka Shuera also understood that their attacks were very strong, and was not sure that this would be enough. Lu agreed with her. He was still thinking about how to strike harder. Captain Khan thought about this. He wondered how to modify his plan, whether it was possible to come up with something more serious. The man gritted his teeth. He knew it would be better to leave it at that to minimize the casualties of their allies. The captain replied that this does not mean that there is no way at all. If they are willing to make some sacrifices, there is one way. Ka Shuera thought that Captain Khan was talking about simply sending soldiers into battle like cannon fodder. This was not Captain Khan's plan, because such an ignorant attack with the thought of dying for honor would not cause much damage to tens of thousands of troops. Ka Shuera didn't know what Captain Khan was going to offer in this case. Lu also looked at the captain in surprise. Having a large number of soldiers in an army is a huge advantage and is also the most important condition for achieving victory. but sometimes it can lead to a fatal crisis. Shuera still didn't understand what Captain Kan meant by this and what they could do to achieve a better result. Captain Kan understood that the entire army would die if there was no food, because people anyway need something to eat. The larger the army, the more food they need. No matter how strong a soldier is, he cannot use his strength when he is hungry. This was Kan's plan. Captain Kan understood that the entire army would die if there was no food, because people anyway need something to eat. The larger the army, the more food they need. No matter how strong a soldier is, he cannot use his strength when he is hungry. This was Kan's plan. Shuera was surprised by this train of thought. The girl did not even think about this decision. The captain was not sure that this was exactly what a person should do, but it was still a good way out of the current situation. Night fell. The enemy army was still in the forest not far from the traps of the allied army. They made a halt in a clearing. The captain's assistant reported to his commander-in-chief that they had successfully broken through to the third line of defense, but they had suffered heavy losses among the troops. The commander-in-chief asked if they could now continue pursuing the prince and the remnants of his royal army. His assistant said they could, but there were some problems. The man hesitated and did not know what to answer. The commander-in-chief realized from the reaction of his subordinate that it looked like it would not be easy. The commander-in-chief noted that it had already taken them a day and a half to push through the third line of defense, even with the power they had. And their opponents just buried themselves in the ground and hid and shot with arrows. This was their excellent strategy to stop their enemies. The commander-in-chief asked what their losses were on the battlefield. The assistant replied that 72 berserkers were killed, and there were also heavy losses among ordinary soldiers. The commander-in-chief was unpleasantly surprised by such large numbers, because with such losses in the troops, this must have greatly reduced the morale of his soldiers. This means that it will not be possible to continue the pursuit now. He ordered a camp to be set up. The enemies were going to rest here and leave early tomorrow morning. Someone was using binoculars to watch the enemy's halt. He thought that this was a useful thing, because you could observe your opponents without getting too close. Armin watched through binoculars. He asked if this thing was from the era of magic, an ancient heritage. Lu turned his head. It wasn't like that. The binoculars came to them from a completely different source. At this time, Captain Kan was sitting nearby. He was cleaning his sniper rifle. Shuera carefully looked around. Lu made binoculars in the likeness of the scope of Captain Kan's sniper rifle. It was his personal design. Armin was surprised. He was glad that Captain Kan brought such useful knowledge with him to their world. Shuera asked him if such a composition of the group would have an effect, if they would be able to advance. The captain replied that if he paused once or twice, the effect would definitely not be strong. Shuera looked at the man in surprise. The reason the United States lost the war in Vietnam, even with overwhelming power, is because the tunnels are dug thick, like a spider's web, all over Vietnam. Constant provocations from the Vietnamese were hell for the Americans, and in the end this is what forced America to retreat. Vietnam won the war. The captain suggested that they first get rid of the supplies, and then throughout the night they planned to provoke their enemy by keeping them awake. Shuera thought it was a great idea to not let the enemy sleep. Besides, soon their food would run out and the enemy would be exhausted. Shuera knew that it would be difficult for them to attack as recklessly as before. However, even if some of them were able to pursue them, it would be a problem. The girl asked Captain Kan when he planned to start raids. The man believed that it was time to start. Captain Kan had a feeling that even the sky was helping them. His opponents must be very tired from fighting all day. It was deep night. The full moon was shining brightly in the sky. Only birds sometimes flew past, covering its glow with their wings. The prince was not sleeping at that time. He was looking up at the sky. His squad managed to break away. Count Lemesandro told the prince that there was no need to worry. They were constantly searching the area and they had a rear guard. Count Lemesandro sent him quite a distance, but there was no sign that the enemy was pursuing them. This was good news. This should be proof that Captain Kan and the others have succeeded, and they and the remnants of their army will soon catch up with the prince. At that moment, some strange rustling was heard next to the guys. They turned around in surprise and looked in that direction. One of the soldiers ran up to him. He said that the allies had arrived, and Count Leo was here. The prince was very happy. This was great news. They had another chance for salvation and victory. The prince, together with Count Lemesandro, quickly ran in that direction to meet Count Leo with help. Count Lemesandro was worried about something worried him, he was very serious. At this time, in the forest, the opponents of the prince's army had already pitched their tents and were preparing for bed, they were resting from the fighting. Not far from their camp, someone was running quickly, they were going to get a little closer to their opponents. It was Ka Shuera, Armin, Lu and some magicians, they were waiting for the right moment to attack their opponents. Ka Shuera considered that the right moment had come, she nodded to Lu, signaling that she could begin the attack. Lu raised his hand, he was about to signal to the other magicians to put Captain Khan's plan into action. The magicians began to cast spells at this time, they created magical fireballs in their hands, the warriors also lit their arrows and were ready. There was a flash of something on a tree nearby, from such a distance it was not clear what it was. Captain Khan was sitting on a tree, he was holding a sniper rifle in his hands and was watching everything that was happening through the scope. Ka Shuera gathered herself, she considered that she needed to act to stop her enemy. The girl raised her hand up, she was ready to give a signal to the prince's army, everyone knew exactly what to do. At this moment, the mages directed their power towards the enemy's camp, their fireballs heading straight towards the enemy. At the same time, the soldiers also fired their arrows from their bows, they covered the enemies with great speed. Ka Shuera and Armin boldly ran into battle, they were armed with blades and a sword, the guys were militant. One of the opponents realized what was happening, it was a surprise attack, the enemies were not ready for it. Ka Shuera, together with Armin, dealt with several enemies in an instant, she took them by surprise, their tactics worked. At that moment, someone drove up to the prince's resting place, it was a man riding a horse, he stopped. His allies arrived to the prince, these were numerous reinforcements of knights on horseback. The prince was very happy, he had been waiting for this army for a long time, and was glad that now there was a chance to defeat the enemy. The man jumped off his horse, he stood right in front of the prince and was also glad to see him. The man was Shin Leo, he introduced himself and greeted His Highness the Prince, the man came to his aid and brought help with him. The man was Shin Leo, he introduced himself and greeted His Highness the Prince, the man came to his aid, the prince said that he arrived just in time. Shin Leo was well aware that his tardiness had caused His Highness great suffering, and he was subject to punishment for failure to fulfill his duty. The prince interrupted him, he didn't think so, the young man was sure that all this happened because of him, because he is the head of state, and he cannot blame anyone for this. Shin Leo asked the prince not to say such things, the crime of failing to protect His Majesty is punishable by death. Count Lemesandro stopped him, because the prince had already forgiven Shin Leo, he asked to end this sycophancy. Shin Leo looked at the count angry, he did not like this attitude on the part of the man, he was clearly not friendly. The prince said that the count was right, they were just about to eat, he invited Shin Leo to join them and talk over everything while eating. The count looked at Shin Leo incredulously, he clearly did not trust the young man's sincere intentions and suspected him. At this time, in the forest, the battle aimed at detaining the enemies continued, it was deep night. Armin mercilessly killed his opponents with a huge sword, he was determined to do whatever it took to win. Ka Shuera fought just as bravely, with one swing of her blade she killed several enemies at once. At that moment, something caught the girl's attention, she looked carefully to the side, and a plan emerged. Ka Shuera pointed to the tent with the enemy's ammunition, she informed Armin about this. Armin realized that this was a great plan, he ordered his men to set fire to the enemy's storage facility in order to leave them without weapons. The knights of the allied army instantly prepared their flaming arrows and fired them at the ammunition storage area. The tent instantly burst into flames, the ammunition exploded one after another, leaving the enemies unarmed. Armin noticed a bright flash behind him rise into the sky, the man turned around and looked at it. Armin immediately understood what this bright light meant, it was a signal to retreat, he ordered his men to leave. The opponents were not going to let them go so easily, they chased after them, hoping not to lose sight of them. Captain Khan believed that this was an excellent job, they achieved their goal and stopped the pursuit of the enemy. Ka Shuera believed that they just needed to return in an hour, Khan added that they would take turns raiding them, keeping them awake. After the enemy recovers from confusion, they get too tired and fall asleep, then the guys attack again. If they repeat these actions multiple times, they will be able to hold them off much longer, exhausting their enemies. Armin asked if the prince and his army had already reached the canyon. Kashuera believed that perhaps reinforcements had already arrived. The captain also hoped that help had come and their plan was successful. Everyone was worried about the fate of the prince. At that moment, strange sounds were heard from the forest. Everyone was alert. Captain Ken looked in that direction. Sounds came from behind the bushes. No one understood what it could be, and who was hiding in the shadows. Everyone was on alert. Kashuera was sure that the enemy had stopped the pursuit. She looked warily into the depths of the forest, and was ready to act. The girl prepared her swords, took a fighting stance, and asked who was here. Lu and the magicians also prepared to defend themselves. They were on the alert and were going to use their magic. A man gradually began to emerge from behind the bushes. He slowly moved aside the branches to pass. Captain Khan was very surprised to see who was hiding in the bushes. He did not expect to see him. Kashuera told the man to show himself, and if he did not introduce himself, his neck would be cut. It turns out that Sir Helishut was hiding behind a bush. No one expected to see him and everyone was confused that he had come. The man walked out behind the bush. He laughed awkwardly and noticed that a lot of time had passed since they last saw each other. Kashuera did not understand how it was possible that Sir Helishut ended up here with him. Helishut explained that they were running along the path and before they knew it, the sun had set. In general they were wondering what to do since they could no longer wander, and then he saw a flame. Kashuera noted that with one wrong turn they would have encountered enemies. Armin believed that this no longer mattered, since they were all safely reunited. Armin met Count Lajun. The man politely extended his hand in greeting. Armin and Lajun shook hands. They were ready to fight together for a common goal. Another hour passed. The moon had already moved from its previous place. It was deep night. The captain believed that it was time to reactivate his actions and carry out a new raid on the enemy in order to prevent him from falling asleep. Armin and his army of elves were in solidarity with the man. They were ready to raid again. Viscount Lajun asked Armin if they were going to attack the enemy now. Armin explained that by this time the enemy should be asleep, and the defense has probably strengthened. However, their goal is only to sow chaos and confusion, this time pretending that fighting will be enough. Armin explained that Captain Ken came up with the plan, and they only had a chance to win thanks to him. Viscount Lajun finally met this man, whom the prince was rumored to have taken into his entourage. It seemed to Viscount Lajun that most likely this man was a foreigner. He was pleasantly surprised by his analytical skills. Behind the Viscount, Urimes looked suspiciously at Captain Khan. The man did not trust the stranger. Urimes did not understand how the prince could take such a suspicious person into his circle. There had never been such a precedent. Kashuera was watching Urimes nearby. She was carefully watching her new acquaintances. The girl noticed how Urimes looked strangely at Captain Khan. She did not trust the man, and expected some kind of trick. The prince's army was replenished with the people of Count Leo. They already had more combat power. The entire army was in formation. At this time, the guy with his army was riding forward. They were heading towards the gorge to build a line of defense there. A luxurious carriage was driving in the center of the column. The army was guarding it, because an important person was riding in it. In the carriage was the prince's sister. She looked out the carriage window to see what was happening outside. The prince pulled the reins and stopped his horse. The prince was very focused. The prince asked Count Leo what he thought about creating a defense right here in this gorge. The man replied that the place was narrow and steep, so if they built a good camp, it would be quite difficult for the enemy to break through. They could also assign mage archers to the canyon as a defense. Count Leo intended to build quarters inside the second line of defense to make it even more difficult for the enemy to break through. The princes looked into the distance with sadness. He understood that thanks to some of his people the chase stopped. He really hoped that they would save their lives. Count Lemisandro said that given that they had yet to see the enemy, he was confident that these people were safe. The prince really hoped for this. He understood that it was impossible to do without casualties in the war, but it worried his soul. Knight Ramesh noticed that they were late and should have already returned from a new attack. The captain was sure that since Kashuera and Lu followed them, everything would be fine, because these two were incredibly strong. At that moment, strange sounds were heard nearby. Knight Ramesh turned around and looked in that direction. Armin drove up to the guys on his combat creature. He braked sharply. Dust was sweating all around. Armin jumped off his beast. He was holding a huge sword in his hands, and his people were also approaching him. Armin reported that the enemies must be desperate. trying to put out the fire. Knight Ramesh instantly ran up to him and asked what this meant. Armin laughed and reported that it was a complete success. Their barracks was a given, but most of their food supplies were burned, so they would not be able to pursue for a while. The captain praised him for his excellent work. Ka Shuera said that it was nothing, everything was successful. Lu added that everything went as Captain Kong said. They had built something of a defensive perimeter, but were still desperately patching up positions damaged by the previous attack. Ka Shuera explained that it was because they didn't expect them to attack again. Their commanders must be furious right now. The girl didn't understand whether they should attack them again. Captain Khan knew that there was no need to attack. They should have left at full speed now. Ka Shuera did not understand what Captain Khan meant, because now the enemy should be in chaos and would not be able to explore them. Captain Khan agreed with the guys, but the enemy forces consisted only of soldiers. Ka Shuera and Armin were very surprised. They didn't even think about it. The guys agreed with their friend. Dawn came, the sun slowly rose from the horizon, illuminating everything around. Riders ran through the forest at full speed. They tried to hide from the enemy as soon as possible. Ka Shuera rode first. They all unquestioningly followed Captain Khan's orders. The girl shouted to the others to move. She was alarmed by something and was trying to run away from something. A huge monster was chasing the guys. He was holding an axe in his hands, and was already catching up with the riders. Ka Shuera did not let him out of sight. She drove at full speed, trying to avoid a sad fate. The monster swung its axe at the guys. It was ready to cut them in half and take revenge on its opponents. At that moment, something quickly flashed before his eyes, and the sound of metal knocking was heard. Someone put his sword in front of the monster's axe, and they fought in a duel. It was Viscount Lajun. He bravely and selflessly tried to stop the monster in order to prevent victims. The guys had a plan. Viscount Lajun gave the others a sign that they needed to act now to stop the enemy. The monster was not alone. There were two more standing behind him. They looked cruelly at the Viscount, wanting to tear him apart. At that moment, something flashed before the monster's eyes again. It was approaching the monsters at great speed. These movements were so fast that the monster did not even have time to see who attacked him. Something broke him into several parts. Ka Shuera was behind the killing of the monster. She moved sharply and was very militant. Ka Shuera exchanged glances with Viscount Lajun. They worked well together to achieve common goals. The girl was not going to give up. Their battle was not over yet. Only one monster had fallen. Viscount Lajun was also serious. He readied his sword and took a fighting stance. Viscount Lajun swung at another monster. He was determined to cut this monster in half. Knight Helishut was very worried about his brothers in arms. He shouted to the Viscount to hit the monster in the core. Viscount Lajun himself understood what needed to be done. He had serious combat experience. Viscount Lajun cut the monster in half in one motion. Black blood splashed around. The monster was defeated. The Viscount said that he was not such a weak person. The man looked at the huge hole in the monster's body. Knight Helishut was amazed at the guy's skills. They easily dealt with the huge creatures. Ka Shuera finished off another one. She hit him right in the stomach. He fell to the ground with a roar. At that moment, something attracted the attention of Ka Shuera and Viscount Lajun. They looked at the sky in surprise. Danger was approaching from there. The sun was at its zenith. It blinded the children's eyes, so it was difficult to see what was coming. Flying monsters were flying in the sky, with riders on them. There was a whole flock of them. They were quickly approaching the guys. The monsters were terrifying in size. Their wingspan was enormous. They flew straight at the guys. Enemy magicians sat astride the monsters. They spoke in their native language, casting spells and starting to cast spells. Lu also saw this picture. He instantly understood what was happening and what magic his opponent was going to use. Lu shouted to Captain Khan to dodge, because now the opponents had activated their magic and would hit them. Captain Khan was not afraid. He knelt down and knew exactly what to do in such a situation. The man readied his sniper rifle. He looked through the scope, trying to make out his opponent. Captain Khan was ready to act. He was going to pull the trigger and shoot straight at the enemy mages. Captain Khan was not afraid. He knelt down and knew exactly what to do in such a situation. The man readied his sniper rifle. He looked through the scope, trying to make out his opponent. Captain Khan was ready to act. He was going to pull the trigger and shoot straight at the enemy mages. Captain Khan with one precise shot neutralized both the flying monster and the magician sitting on it. Blood splashed around. The rider and his creature fell to the ground like a stone. The captain's accuracy was excellent. Captain Khan decided to continue to act this way. He wanted to neutralize as many opponents as possible with the help of successful shots. At that moment, a Kashuera girl ran up to him, stopped the captain, and said that this would not help, because there were too many opponents. Knight Helishut believed that they needed to move and run away as quickly as possible, since they could not defeat their opponents. Viscount La June said that he would take care of the rear and cover the guys while they were saved. Knight Helishut nodded to the Viscount in solidarity. He was grateful to the man for his help. The guys set off. Kashuera was the first to gallop. She quickly ran away from the chase, leading the entire squad. They were followed by flying monsters with magicians on them. Their goal was to deal with the guys. The chase lasted for many kilometers. The guys kept running away, trying to get away from danger. Captain Khan turned back. He was not sure that they would be able to escape, and was thinking about what plan to come up with. At that moment, Kashuera shouted to Captain Khan to look ahead, because there was danger waiting for him. The man looked forward excitedly. If it weren't for the girl, he would not have had time to react and would have gotten hurt. There was a huge explosion right in front of them. It was the enemy attacking. The guys managed to react in time and avoid their fate. The captain was surprised by the power of the explosion. He galloped away and turned around to look at the consequences of the explosion. At this time, Pedra was waiting for the guys in a safe place. She was excited and worried about the fate of her people. Pedra asked Laura if this place was really safe. The girl was very scared. Laura explained that it would be difficult for the enemies to get inside, and no matter how big they were in strength, so it would be difficult for them to overwhelm the gorge with numbers. This calmed Pedra a little, but she was still worried about something and nervously scratched her hands. Pedra knew that the further they got stuck in this canyon, the more their food supplies would diminish. Winter is also coming. It must be very difficult for their people. The girl did not understand what to do and how to help her people. Laura tried to cheer Pedra up. She took her hand and agreed that it would be hard, but all they could do now was believe in Prince Orang. Pedra sighed heavily. She was glad that there was a person next to her who would always support her. Laura explained that reinforcements had arrived today, and if news of their situation reached other places, the course of this war would change. The girl's mood changed a little. She smiled and agreed with her friend. There was hope for a bright future. And at this time, Prince Orang was also happy about something. He ran up to someone and asked if it was true. An envoy came to the prince. He said that under the leadership of Baron Kazan, several nobles from the south were gathering one after another. He told the Baron to come here. Baron Kazan said that he would follow the order, but the shortest route for Baron Kazan's people to get here is not easy. Count Lemisandro understood that the man was talking about Lafia's path. This was the road that stretches from the city of Mireia, where Baron Kazan is located, to this place. In the middle there is a city known as the Holy City of the Enemy. The prince asked what the Baron would do in this case. He said that if the prince gave his support, he would try to break the enemy's line of defense. Count Lemisandro knew that they would otherwise have no choice but to abandon Lufia's high road and take a detour. The prince wondered how long it would take Baron Kazan to get here. The count explained that he would have to take the path through the mountains, which would take about twice as long, about 15 days. The prince was very surprised at this amount of time. They definitely couldn't hold out for half a month. Silence hung around. Everyone present was thinking about how to solve this situation and quickly bring the Baron here. Count Leo thought they should give him a try. The prince asked what the man was offering. The count asked to give him 1,000 warriors to support his knights. He was going to lead them south and open the way together with Baron Kazan. Count Lemisandro believed that the problem was not only taking 1,000 soldiers from them, but also that the enemy forces in their holy city would be considerable. Count Leo grinned. He was confident in his abilities and knew that he would succeed. The man said that his methods are a trade secret. He cannot tell Count Lemisandro about it. He got angry, because it seemed like Leo didn't trust him or harbored malicious intent towards the prince. The prince stopped their arguments. He didn't like it when his subjects argued without a good reason. But they still had no other choice. They had to quickly make decisions and act, which is what the prince was going to do. The prince ordered Count Leo to do what he had to do. He was ready to support him in exchange for help. Count Lemisandro was very angry. He thought this was a mistake. Leo said that he would return only with success, as His Majesty orders. Prince Orang was also not sure of his decision. Times were very difficult and he could use help and support from his loyal subjects. At this time, the guys broke away from the enemy. They ran onto the plain and decided to rest a little. Armin noted that it looked like the enemy had given up pursuit for now. Knight Helishut offered to spend the night here. Since everyone was tired, Kashuera added that the forest at night is dangerous, even for them. Knight Helishut was planning to set up camp here. Armin said that they will take care of surveillance and patrolling. Urimes was going to help Armin with patrolling. The elves would be very grateful to the man for his help. Urimes said that they did not participate in the operations, so his people still had strength. It was deep night, the moon rose in the sky and illuminated the quiet but dangerous forest. All the allied people were sleeping near the trees. They were very tired after such intense battles earlier. They needed to rest. At that moment, someone was awake. He was walking, clinking his armor. It was not clear where he was going. The man stopped. It was strange that he was not sleeping at this hour. The man was Urimes. He seemed to have hidden intentions. The man was clearly up to something. Urimes looked very angry. He was going to implement his insidious plan. The man walked a few more meters, after which he stopped. He was very serious. His intentions were not clear. Near the tree to which Urimes approached, Captain Khan was sleeping peacefully, holding his sniper rifle in his hands. Urimes had a long, bloody knife in his hand. Not far away on the ground lay the corpse of one of the elves. There was a pool of blood around. Apparently this was the work of Urimes. The elf's blood was slowly flowing down the man's knife. It looked like he was going to do the same to Captain Khan. Near the tree to which Urimes approached, Captain Khan was sleeping peacefully, holding his sniper rifle in his hands. Urimes had a long, bloody knife in his hand. Not far away on the ground lay the corpse of one of the elves. There was a pool of blood around. Apparently this was the work of Urimes. The elf's blood was slowly flowing down the man's knife. It looked like he was going to do the same to Captain Khan. Urimes swung his knife and was about to repeat the elf's share with Captain Khan. However, Kashuera arrived in time to help Captain Khan. She sharply pushed Urimes, and prevented the implementation of his plans. Urimes was very surprised. He did not expect that someone would interfere with his plans. The man was pushed on the shoulder. Urimes was thrown some distance away by Kashuera's blow. She arrived just in time to prevent trouble. Because of this commotion, the rest of the guys woke up. The elves and soldiers looked at what was happening in surprise. Captain Khan himself woke up. He didn't even notice how there was an attempt on his life in his sleep. Armin was very angry. He screamed loudly and asked what Urimes was doing, and why he was not going to kill Captain Khan. Urimes was lying on the floor. He was doubled over in pain, but the man was not going to give up. Kashuera hit the man hard with her shoulder. She asked who Urimes works for. Urimes raised his gaze and looked at the girl cruelly. He was surprised that she was asking who he worked for. Kashuera decided not to wait for an answer. She flew straight at him with a blade in her hand. She was going to kill the enemy. Knight Helishut shouted to the girl to stop. Because they had not yet found out all the information, it would be stupid to kill him like that. Kashuera put her sword to Urimes' neck. She still wanted to hear the answer for whom this traitor was working. Kashuera thought that Count Leo might be Urimes' mercenary. She looked at the man angrily. Urimes laughed. He was not going to give away his secrets. He had other goals. Urimes sharply pulled out the blade from his sleeve with one movement of his hand. It was hidden for an emergency. Lu watched everything in surprise. He did not expect that there would be a traitor among their squad. Urimes ran sharply around Kashuera. He was very dexterous, and with a blade in his hands was heading towards his victim. Kashuera managed to react quickly. She jumped into the air, wanting to stop the man. The girl used her fighting techniques and kicked Urimes in the back. Urimes flew away. The click of his bones was heard. Urimes landed on the ground. He fell with a roar. The man was in great pain because the blow was strong. Urimes tried to clear his throat. He doubled over in pain again, and was very angry that his plan had failed. Urimes fell right in front of Captain Khan. He did not understand at all what was happening. He looked at everything that was happening in surprise. Kashuera was very angry. She was going to finish off this traitor and protect Captain Khan. At this time, the Knight Helishut put a saddle on his horse. Armin asked what he was trying to do now. Knight Helishut replied that they needed to go immediately. Right now, the man was excited. Kashuera did not understand what Knight Helishut meant and why such a rush. Knight Helishut explained that the prince was in danger. because traitors were hidden in the ranks of his army. At this time, someone was walking along the gorge. It was a dark night, but this person did not sleep. It was the princess. She came to the edge of the gorge and was waiting for someone. The sounds of an owl were heard from the other side. The girl got scared and looked in that direction in surprise. However, they did not pose a danger. The princess was still waiting for someone. The girl had already relaxed, thinking that no one would come, and exhaled with relief. At that moment she noticed something. The princess concentrated and was surprised. A man was walking towards her from the darkness. He was quickly approaching the girl. His face was not visible, but he probably knew the princess. She recognized him. The man handed the girl something in his hand. He was going to give this item to the princess. The girl was very surprised and scared. She backed away, not understanding what was happening now. In his hands the man was holding a beautiful necklace with a large diamond in the center. This is what he was going to give to the princess. There was a mark on the princess's hand, which was hidden by the bracelet. It looked like a small flame. The second this necklace appeared, the mark lit up red. It was magical. The man said that the princess had come all this way and they couldn't let her leave without rewards. The man said that at first he was very surprised and was not sure about everything that was happening. He couldn't think that the princess would be Silver Mana. The mark on the gorilla girl's hand is getting stronger. It seems she was also a traitor to the prince. At this time, the younger prince was calmly resting in his tent. He slept soundly and did not suspect anything. At some point, the boy woke up in horror. He seemed to be tormented by nightmares. He looked around, but his sister was nowhere to be found. One of his servants came into the tent and asked if something had happened to the younger prince. The boy woke up, but did not see his older sister. Knight Ramish was very surprised, because it was his task to protect the members of the royal family. Knight Ramish and the younger prince went in search of his sister. They looked around the tents around, hoping to find her. At that moment, Knight Ramish noticed something nearby. He turned around in surprise to understand what was happening there. In front of them was a tent with a light on. It was late at night, so it was strange. Knight Ramish opened the door of the tent. He already thought that something had happened to the princess. Knight Ramish was horrified when he saw what happened in this tent. He did not expect this. In the tent, he saw a bloody sword. Drops of blood slowly flowed from it and fell to the ground. One of the soldiers was lying on the floor. A pool of blood was spreading around. The man was brutally killed. The killer recognized the Knight Ramish. The knight was already ready to defend himself and finish off the traitor. Count Leo was in the tent. He was responsible for the murder of one of the knights. It seems that he revealed the betrayal of Count Leo, for which he was punished. A man stood in the middle of the tent with a bloody sword in his hands. At that moment, the younger prince entered the tent and asked whether the Knight Ramish had found his sister. The boy was shocked by the picture he saw in the tent. It was too cruel for a small child. The younger prince looked at Count Leo with horror. He was overcome with fear. The boy began to tremble. Count Leo grinned and looked slyly at his opponents. It looked like he was going to do away with everyone who knew the secret about him.